Okay, looks like we are all back together again. I hope everybody had a good lunch. And as we move around the state, this is our last time in Sacramento, I think, for a little while. I don't remember, Carrie, when do we come back here at some point, I think?
In June.
In June. Next month we'll be in Irvine. And somebody had asked if it was possible to have the meals actually at the meeting in the hotel. That is, but and it could be worked out, and we'd be happy to send you information in advance. Generally, when you're in a hotel, you're going to probably have a little bit more of an expense than if you were to go outside. So that's something I'm open to hearing people's opinion on as to what you want to do. I understand that Senator Bell is on his way. And I want to introduce somebody who's in the back of the room, Eric Thronson from It's from Senate. I was waiting for him to take his hat off before he Eric is with Senate Transportation. Oh, there's Senator Bell. And this is probably a great opportunity. Some of the questions that came out at the our last session on how issues were formulated and everything, probably the one person that could answer a lot of that better than anybody, because he was handling it at the staff level, is Eric. Senator, good to see you, sir. And so, I don't know, Eric, if you want to just give just a little bit of a primer, a little bit of background, and then, again, because this is an interactive discussion, we don't, just speak up at any point. If there's issues at some juncture, I've told Eric, I said, wave your hand if you want to add into it, because I think he could, or if folks wanted to ask Eric. So, Eric, why don't you just introduce yourself again and just give a little bit of perspective.
Sure. Thank you, Commissioner. I just wanted you all to know, again, my name is Eric Thronson. I worked for Senator DeSaulnier when he authored this bill, was principally involved in writing the language. And so if there comes time when questions are, well, what did they mean when they wrote that in SB 1077, I may be able to help answer that question, at least what those of us, the staff, meant when we wrote it. So, that's I just wanted you to know I was here. I'll be at all the meetings except for the ones in Southern California, and staffing Senator Bell now on this, and so I'm just trying to be as helpful as I can to the group.
And I'd like to give Eric a shout out. I mean, I think he did a great job of shepherding that bill through. He took a lot of input. It went through a few twists and turns, and I think he just kept true to the purpose of exploration of this issue, in the best way possible. So appreciate that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, so let's look next at item 8 on our agenda, and with that, we're going to turn it back to Carrie, where we're going to get into the global evolution of the whole road charging policy.
So taking the previous agenda item that Shannon presented to you on the policy dimensions, we're now going to start to connect the dots of what has happened nationally and internationally, lessons learned and best practices, and how we can use that information in forming our policy decisions. And so Jack will be preparing that.
Thank you very much, Carrie. I would really like to echo what Chairman Daffer said. I want this to be interactive. If there's something that I'm saying or something that you would like to inject at that point, just let me know and we can address your question as we go along. Even take it down new avenues. This is basically to try to take you as the idea of a distance charge has evolved across the world. Different examples of it that do come back to a lot of the policy things that we talked about earlier with Shannon. Try to highlight that where people have addressed that or have tried to address it in the context of their country. And I know it's important here in California to keep saying, okay, that's nice that they did it in New Zealand, but really what does it have to do with us? But I think it's important to also understand the way they possibly looked at it, which may help you in your thinking as you're addressing that same policy issue here. So, again, let's make this very interactive. We talked before, and Shannon was hinting at it, is this whole idea that all of these policy issues and subjects are highly interrelated. You have some brilliant people at Cal Berkeley, Horst Ritter, who came up with the issue of, or the explanation for these types of problems that are highly interconnected, and he got termed the wicket problem. Because every time you touch an area, it has some repercussions in another area, because there's a dependency between those areas. When we look at the system concept of road charging, I've even just tried to highlight several of them that we're going to be addressing, and that doesn't look too bad. But when you start digging in below the surface, it blows up very quickly as to all of those features. Everything when we talk about something that's going to happen in technology for standard that may have an impact over on policy and protecting PII. Something that would happen in the organization, which then is going to flip back to operational costs. And we're not going to address all of these today, but just the idea that we understand this is a wicked problem, and that the dependencies are there, and that's why the discussion and the different disciplines that were brought together for this group are highly important for addressing the issue. One thing I did work on in New Zealand was, after the system in New Zealand had been in since 1978, the Minister of Transport formed an independent review group in 2009 to readdress the system. So after it had been working for 50 years and evolved over 50 years, another independent look at it to say, what we're doing, is it right? How should we change it? And I thought one of the best things that came out of it, and I thought it was good guidance for this group, is this quote that I took out of the report. A good charging system should not be discarded in pursuit of a perfect system. This thing that we highlighted this morning, you don't have to come up with the perfect system, but it should be a good system. And that if you make it too complicated, if you put too much into it, you're really giving quite a bit of room for others to come away and chip away at it over time and undermine it. So in thinking through what we're going to do on this journey, that the idea that we're not trying to be perfect, we're trying to be good. Now, I know this chart shows up all the times, and we chatted about it previously. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. But in those two dimensions of VMT growth and then declining revenues, what I'd like to do is address the bottom one for a minute. I mean, we all know that vehicle miles traveled, either because of people having to live in further away from their work, or the fact that changing jobs, they may have to go longer distances, or just the number of vehicles entering the fleet are all having an impact of that VMT number. But when we look at where the fleet is and where the fleet's going, and this is just fuel economy by model year from federal data, and we just looked at cars, light trucks, and then the combined set. Underneath the new directives by the federal government called the CAFE standards, the CAFE standards are pushing that number up. In 2016, it's supposed to be the average for the fleet. And again, it's an average number. Lots of ins and outs on how that's calculated. But essentially, it's, they want it to go to 30, for a light vehicle, 34.5 miles per gallon is sort of the average in 2016. But then by 2025, what Chairman Medaffer was talking earlier about, that's not that far down the street. That's right around the corner. Those numbers go into 54, 55 miles per gallon.
And those are averages for new cars, not
Yes.
what's on the road.
Correct. And then when you look at the average in between, what does that do to the whole fleet when you look at the light vehicles, whether they're the less fuel efficient light trucks or the more efficient vehicles like the Prius and whatnot, you start seeing that the fleet average, and then when you look at the bespoke fleet that's out there today dragging that down, we're still looking at something in the area of about 36 miles per gallon. I think the average number today is in California is around 21 or 22. So that's where we think that jumps to. And if you look at the fuel efficiency of different vehicles, this is just kind of a chart that has come out of actually Toyota that kind of mapped out how they were going to evolve the Prius over time, where simple things like start-stop technology, where your engine automatically shuts off when you're at a stop sign, and then when you go to leave the stop sign, it turns back on. I mean, that gets you like 3 to 4% extra efficiency on the vehicle. And then you start looking at adding that with regenerative braking to recharge the hybrid, and you start moving up the ladder to what we have, excuse me, on what's got introduced about 5 to 7 years later, which is the whole plug-in hybrid, on where it moves up that efficiency curve. Another way of looking at it is this way, and I'm sorry for all the acronyms that are on that. On the left, you have a hybrid electric vehicle, then a plug-in hybrid electric vehicle, and then an electric vehicle, and then a fuel cell a hybrid electric vehicle. And this is, again, maps out where Toyota in their engineering saw the development And that last block, that fuel cell hybrid electric vehicle, is what you're seeing them introduce in the hydrogen vehicle that's coming into the fleet this year. So each one of these puts us further into the efficiency category, and on that bottom line that was there, that dotted line, may even look very conservative when you start seeing that we're getting this not just from Toyota, that's just one manufacturer, but we're getting it from European manufacturers and other Japanese manufacturers and U.S. manufacturers too. Now, because of that gap, lots of people around the world have addressed this issue of road use charge. It's not unique to California. It's not unique to the United States. In some ways, Europe has been further ahead in regards to pushing energy-efficient vehicles than the U.S. has, even though they don't have CAFE standards. And different countries have addressed some of these schemes to look at, or some of these processes or policies to look at increasing money on their road use. And then there's some that you don't normally see in the U.S. The idea of demand management or congestion charges that have taken place in Singapore, Stockholm, London, vignettes. Vignette is a way in Europe, it comes from a French word for meaning a little tiny sticker that you have to buy by time for use of the motorways or use of their main streets. And you pay for it on time. You buy it in day blocks. Even if you're visiting, if any of you are going to go to Hungary or go into the Czech Republic or go skiing in Austria, you have to buy a vignette for the rental car when you take it out. And you can buy it for a week or buy it for a 2-week period. It's maybe like €5 a week, but that's money for charging you for the usage of the roads. And it's just a pre-bought tag or license on time. And then, of course, there's been road charging. And again, for road charging or vehicle miles traveled, we have examples out of New Zealand and attempts in other countries. And then, of course, you have some people that said, well, why am I traveling by miles? Maybe we should do it by engine runtime. It's a lot simpler, a lot less privacy invasion, and it's every time I turn my engine on, it's turning a clock on, and it's clocking up to say I'm running my vehicle, so therefore there's a charge for every minute that I'm running the vehicle. Now, I'm not going to get into the basis of the bill. I think Eric can answer your questions in regards to the bill. But from the study that was done in Southern California, when we looked at the express travel study, out of the modeling and cost, we looked at different options that were appeared on that other chart, an idea of HOV over the whole region. We looked at dual-lane HOV networks. We looked at tolling all of the interstates. We looked at, in the SCAG region, we looked at cordon pricing in downtown LA and around the airport. Then we looked at VMT, and we looked at VMT both as a fixed price per mile and then a variable price based on time. Well, that bottom number of HOV region-wide express lanes, the one, we use that to normalize the numbers, but that basically is almost exactly about the amount of revenue it created, about $1 billion a year. When we start to look at the other options in comparison to HOV, we found that if we had dual-lane express lanes, it would make about 1.5 times the amount of revenue. When we looked at tolling the interstates, it came at about 3.5 times the revenue. The cordon price in downtown LA was a real winner, and it moved that needle up to about 5 times the revenue of the HOV lanes. But when we looked at VMT, it was coming out 9 to 12 times better in a revenue production, in a revenue collection, or a revenue generation. And they actually are, those numbers that I used were in net revenue. So we took care of the operating cost being subtracted out of those numbers.
Fixed and variable refer to time?
It was variable by time, and what we did in the model was say during the periods of the morning rush hour and the afternoon rush hour, the prices would be higher. And it was actually interesting because the 3 parameters that we had to evaluate it on that study, and Stephen, you may remember that one, it was, reduction of VMT, improvements to the environment, and revenue generation. And across all of them, the VMT came out, the VMT variable came out the best.
I try to put some of that stuff out of my mind, but but anyway, these obviously have assumptions on how much would be charged.
Yes, it did.
To generate these things.
And what are the assumptions on the VMT pricing?
At the time, the assumptions of the VMT pricing were like 4.1 cents
Per mile.
per mile. And the variable moved it from off-peak, which was like 2 cents per mile in the off-peak periods, and in the peak periods, 6 cents per mile. So it's within that range. But we weren't talking, one of the problems with addressing this subject that you'll find when you talk to at cocktail parties or you talk to your friends is that many times, and we saw this in data from a Washington COG study when they went out and asked the general public, if there's tolling in the area, the first numbers they're going to assume is it's going to be in dollars because that's what people get charged for crossing the Bay Bridge or for, a typical toll road ride comes out. You used to do that in quarters, but now it's in dollars. And so the first number they'll jump to in their mind is thinking in terms of dollars. And it usually is a bit of a eye-opening exercise when you start saying, no, we're talking about pennies. We're talking about pennies per mile. We're not talking about, dollars per mile. But it is one of the things that you will probably face as you go along talking to friends or talking to the public. Lots of distance-related experiments and systems in the world. As I said, in New Zealand, it's interesting because it's being done from 78 until 2010, after the 2011, after the independent group, which then allowed them to go to commercial account managers, and they allowed the commercial account managers to take the risk on technology. The government didn't want to take the risk on supplying people technology for fear it would get outdated. And so they said, we'll let the commercial account managers do that, but it was a paper-based system. And paper-based system in that you pre-bought miles. So you would go in and you would pre-buy miles, and you can buy it as small as 1,000. In this case, it's kilometers. Excuse me for saying miles, but just to speak in the common terms, we'll talk about it in miles. And the reason 1,000 was picked was because that was a number that was easily digestible by the lower income groups. So for something that would be about $6, I can buy 1,000 miles. And if, depending how much I use, then I can come back and buy another 1,000 miles, or I can buy it in 5,000 or 10,000 mile blocks. So they had specific blocks that you could pre-buy. If you could afford it, people were buying 10,000. No discount, same price, just multiplied by the factor. And you had to give your odometer reading when you started, and then when you so that if I bought 1,000 miles, the next time I bought it, if my odometer reading was somewhere within the range, that was fine. If it was over, they would basically come back, and you would have less on the second block of 1,000 miles. And if you were stopped by the police and they checked to see that you had the right license for the miles that were on your odometer, because they were doing it by the odometer on your private car, they would basically give you a tolerance of about 10%. So you could say, well, I haven't had a chance to get to to go buy the license. So but I'm on my way there now is usually the answer. And they're saying, well, you're okay. You're within the 10% balance. That's okay. If you were out of balance, anything over out of balance was at a 3-time multiplier. So your fine was set into it to say you had to pay 3 times as much for any miles that you hadn't bought ahead of time. And that worked on both trucks and cars. And in this system, to be perfectly set, and it's kind of the inverse of what you're looking at, this was on diesel-powered vehicles. Because they left the gas tax on petrol or gasoline-powered vehicles, but for diesel, they took the tax off and made you pay by a road charge. And in 1978, other than one Mercedes, which they had none in country, there were no diesel-powered cars. But since about the 90s, they've had an influx of diesel-powered cars that have come from Europe and have come from Japan. Jumping down that list, you talk about Switzerland, and there we put, again, this was on trucks, but it was a cross-reference between the odometer, or the tachograph as they refer to it, that was a feed off the odometer, and GPS. And the big thing that we learned there is that odometers aren't perfect. Odometers don't have a standard. With the car you buy that has an odometer, it's up to the manufacturer to put in the odometer. There's no quality standard in how good it is. But they basically range about in the U.S., they'll raise about 1.5% to 2.5%. In Switzerland on the trucks, we found some that were 4% out of tolerance. But the 4% out of tolerance, I think, goes a long way to say when you start thinking of Switzerland, you've got a lot of hills, you've got a lot of snow, you have a lot of ice. The basics of an odometer is that it's on the turning of the axle. So if you're slipping and your tires are spinning, you're actually running up what will look like to the odometer that you're running up mileage. Other than the mountains, I mean, we don't really have a lot of that problem here in California. So I think you're going to be in about plus or minus 1.5% range. When you look at that, the big one that gets everybody attention is the GPS system that's in Germany, where it was put onto the trucks. The interesting thing there was they actually combined it with environmental policy, and there was a price that you paid for the distance, for the mileage that you drove, based on the weight category, the gross vehicle weight carrying capability of your truck. But then there was another factor that said, how clean was your diesel engine? And in Europe, they have what's called Euro-class engines, and it goes 0 being the dirtiest to 6 being the cleanest. And they then use those classifications, 0 through 6, to say if your truck was, at 4, 5, or 6, then you got a multiplier of 1. It was the same thing. If you were in the 3 to 4 range, then you had a slight plus up in the multiplier. And if you're in the dirty range, then you had a really big multiplier on. Now, I bring that one up because from a worldwide experience, what that proved within about 2 years after the system went in, most trucks on the German Autobahn were Euro Class 4 or better. So it actually changed the amount of emissions that were being put into the environment because they had an environmental charge.
And was there research that showed that there was a causal link between the surcharge on the mileage and the cleaner engines?
There was some feedback that was done by the group Toll Collect who was doing it, and they looked at going in and they did interviews with some of the companies to find out why they changed. And the other side of it, they said, because I want to save money.
So it was anecdotal.
Yes. When we look at Austria, we get into, again, another GPS system. Oh, I'm sorry, Australia was a GPS system.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could, again, because
Yes, please.
when you say it's a GPS system, what does that mean? And, because I see GPS on many of these, but I'm not sure that it's the same thing in every country. What are they actually doing?
Yes, and really you're right. I mean, I'm saying GPS because the heart of the system in order to measure the mileage, the independent device to measure the mileage, was a GPS-based system with an algorithm to keep calculating points and distance between points. When we looked at in Switzerland the comparison of the odometer reading versus the GPS, because that's the one place that we were able to put the two of them together, we found the GPS over the centerline distances was within 0.5%. Maybe the centerline distances were measured wrong, but the GPS was far more accurate than the odometer. And then the other one that's up there, and I'm sorry for all the acronyms, the technical side comes out of me. DSRC is Dedicated Short Range Communication. So this is like your fast track tag that you have on your cars for being read going through the toll plazas. But remember, that is in some ways, a very dumb device. It needs something else, where the GPS typically was a system that had the GPS receiver, so it could position itself on the Earth's surface, usually a map to associate that position to, and then it usually ended up with a communications means. Like in Germany, they use SMS messages to send the data. In other places, they've used more secure networks to send it over, and the data was encrypted when it left and was unencrypted at the other end.
Right, and so the interesting question to me, whenever you're talking about something like an electronic, location-based charging, is whether or not it's because if you're just charging based on distance, then anyone other than the car owner actually needs to know is the distance.
Yes.
And so if you have everything done internally with the map, then the only data that passes is 7 miles or, whatever for a given 24-hour period, which has very different privacy implications than transmitting the
Absolutely.
location history.
And
so that's the variable.
Yeah, and I'm glad
data.
we're doing this interactively, because that's a great point that, sometimes in looking at what I'm presenting, I'll skip over, and I'm glad you brought me back to that point. In all of these cases, essentially what's reported is mileage reported. And in a lot of cases, like in the Swiss system, it doesn't even leave the vehicle. all the calculations are inside of the device that's in the vehicle. And at the end of the month, they actually put in what looks like a smart card into the device, press a button, downloads onto the smart card, and then they send the smart card in, and then the data is read off the smart card by the agency. And when it reads those files, in truth, there's two sets of files. There is a set of files that said, here's the mileage that I'm reporting for the month, and they get a printout of that so they can see it, and they actually have to sign a statement when they send it in. But then there's also hidden files on it. And that's not to try to trick them up, but it's a cross-reference of what the odometer said versus what the readings were, so that if there was something that's amiss, they can go back and say, wait a minute, this isn't right. How can we see this difference between what the odometer is telling us and what you're telling us? Okay, so it's part of their enforcement technique too. But again, the data is on the smart card. It never goes through the cloud where anybody else could look at it. In other systems like the Australian system, it does go over a wireless network and it's encrypted when it gets. But again, the mileage is mileage reported. It's not locations reported. And if you think about it from a system viewpoint, that gets to be a big message. And all of these messages are really short messages that can get, if you can send it over SMS, you can send it over, over another communication means very quickly. In London, we have something that's done by video. But again, that's a defined area. So when you come inside of the M25 motorway, the truck gets recorded by a video camera. But there's a catch to that, because in Europe, and in some other countries of the world, if you're talking about a tractor trailer, the tractor has a license plate, and in our system, the trailer has a completely different license plate. But in Europe, they have magnetic license plates that have to be mounted on the back of the vehicle, so that if I'm reading the vehicle, I can either read the license plate off the tractor or read it off the back of the truck, and it has to be the same license plate. In fact, they have checks to see if it's two different license plates, then that is one that they'll cite for carrying two different license plates. And then there were trials on GPS in Sweden and here in the States. So I don't want to lose sight that we do have still 4 states that do weight distance, and that's Oregon, New Mexico, Kentucky, and New York. So even in the States, we still have weight distance. Most of the states have moved away from weight distance, and some of that they haven't done by choice. Some of that the American Trucking Association has taken to court and said that that's inefficient, we don't like that, so we want you to change it. And some of them didn't fight it, some of them just rolled over and said, okay, fine, we'll change it. So there's a lot in the reason why we no longer do weight distance on trucks in the United States. Oregon is one of those that actually, when faced with that court case, took on the truckers and said, no, we don't agree with that, and their courts found in favor of Oregon to keep the weight distance. Road charging internationally, and here I'm getting into situations that's really more into light vehicles and cars. Again, New Zealand has done it since '78. And maybe the message here is, you look at those numbers and see United Kingdom goes from 1964 to present. That's a long time. And the Smead report and a lot of the reports that came out in '64 for them to look at, they made repeated attempts on it, and either the technology wasn't ready, or the policy wasn't ready, or they just were not ready for it. And then they came back to it again and again and again. Like in the Netherlands, the last one here to 2010, really it was a question that they abandoned it because the coalition government fell apart. And unlike our two-party political systems, you're talking political systems that have 15 to 20 different parties. And so every election is a coalition. And in this case, the main party that was holding coalition together had supported the United States and the Middle East, and there was a bit of a backlash to that, and the party fell apart. And when it fell apart, the road charging plans fell apart. And Hong Kong, and actually that's not correct. I'm sorry, Susan, you pointed this out yesterday. I should have corrected it. There was the study done in '83, '85, the study that I did in '97 to 2000, another study I did in 2006 for Hong Kong, and I just got a call they're going to do it again in 2013. So I'll probably get another chance to go to Hong Kong. 2015, sorry.
Did any of these differentiate between publicly owned or privately owned roads?
Yes. In New Zealand, even though it was a paper-based system, there was a means for you to put in and file a report to say that you had off-road travel that was not on the public network and get compensated for that. With the GPS system that's being tried in Singapore, the trials, I reviewed their GPS data. They actually had all the map that said you were private road or off-road, so off-road miles were not counted. And in the system that was done in the UK that we looked at in 2009 and 10, that was what they refer to as time, distance, position system. That in that system, if you were off-road or on private road, those miles didn't count. And the system separated that. Again, I hate to keep coming back to New Zealand, but I'm doing it only for that it's our biggest body of how an operating system works. One of the things that's the question is, what's the cost of operations? And we've studied that here in the U.S. states. We did modeling of cost in Oregon. We've done a business case in Washington State. In Oregon, we found that it depended on how many vehicles were in the system. I mean, we're talking about even all their vehicles. When we count them, it's like 4 million vehicles in Oregon. Washington State's about 6 million vehicles. You have 36 million vehicles. And obviously, as with any transaction processing system, the more accounts, the bigger the denominator, the smaller the number. New Zealand is closer to Oregon. It had about 4 million vehicles. And but in those 4 million vehicles total, the amount that was into diesel was much smaller, but their cost of operations are just slightly over 1%. And they run a great cost accounting system to constantly check that number, and their cost accounting takes it back to processing fees and down to the cost of the stamp to send the bills out. So, you know, it's a very accurate accounting that they have to give to their government on the cost of operations, and it's a pretty good number. When we looked at numbers in Washington State said, we don't like this idea at this point of talking about commercial account managers. We want government to run it, and our numbers there run somewhere 9 to 11% of overhead to the system. If in Oregon we looked at commercial account managers, and we found that when we got above about 1.5 million vehicles, that number can go down to 3.5 to 5% with commercial account managers. So as we get into open-close systems, as Shannon pointed out earlier, we start talking about, do we want this strictly in the hands of government, or do we want it to have a partnership with private industry? There's a good cost reason usually to work with private industry. They can do the accounting and the account management for the people better. And in some focus groups that we've been privy to, outside of the ones we worked on, like in Georgia, one of the big things got to be people trusted somebody that was a commercial account manager when they found that a commercial account manager was Allstate Insurance or one of the insurance companies, because they already gave them their information. And this was just part of their insurance and pay-as-they-drive insurance, and they just had a lot of trust in those people and less trust in the focus groups when they said it was going to be run by government. Now, I know this is California, so that probably doesn't apply. But we, but it is interesting to note differences across some of these numbers. One of the things that the UK has done, and this gets into communications, and Pam, I think this comes back to some of your concerns earlier. Because of the amount of focus on doing this repeatedly, there was lots of press and pretty good knowledge about how transport taxes were raised and used in the UK. So in the 2006 RAC report, Royal Automobile Club, RAC for the acronym, and they went out, and again, this poll was not to the general public, this was to their membership. But 63% of the people would be in favor of a road charge if the money goes back to the roads. Now, that you may think that's self-evident, but one of the problems in Europe and in the UK is that the money goes to Treasury. So all of the money that's collected on the gas tax, all the money that's collected on any taxes for a new car, licensing fees typically went into the government, but registration fees sometimes stayed local. I think they raised about 70, last count I did, translated to U.S. dollars and exchange rates, is about $76 billion a year off their taxes. I mean, your gallon of gas, 63% of what you pay for a gallon of gas in the UK is taxes. It's one of the highest in the world. And it just so happens that many of the people, but then when the money goes into Treasury, 76 billion goes in, only about 22 comes back to transportation. Only about 12 of that finds its way to roads. So, in some surveys, I remember Steve's not here, but his associates in the UK, the Automobile Association Trust, wrote a report several years ago that basically said that motorists feel they're being ripped off, they by the amount of taxes they pay and what they see coming back to the road. So this first statistic's easily understandable when you put it in that context. The other side said that 69%, when they understand how the money is collected and where it goes, 69% were very much in favor of saying, let's replace it. Let's replace the gas tax with the road charge in that survey. And the most startling one, and this comes back to the technology area, 80 to 87% said if this was built into my car, if it was part of the vehicle telematics, I'm in favor of it. They didn't want to see another device put in, but if it was already part of the car, then they were in favor of it. So there's some interesting stats there. This is a scary diagram. Now, this was a diagram that came out of studies that we did in New Zealand, and that's why at the time we were hung up. We didn't know if it was a fee or a charge or a tax or a toll or a tariff. So that's why that box looks complicated. But regardless of how you want to calculate it, this is, and I'm not picking on Transport Economist, but essentially this was laid out by Transport Economist to say if we were going to make this equitable, if we were going to look at all the categories of equity, we should consider all of these issues. A vehicle classification, if I'm carrying weight, and that really had to do with trucks. Distance traveled, that's pretty straight. Time of day. Location, because sometimes time and day and location, when you start talking congestion, those are the two big dynamics, because not all roads are congested. And, sometimes only specific locations are congested and others are uncongested. And then an environmental factor. And then if I'm talking about a carpool or something like that, maybe by the number of passengers. So these got to be the elements that when we start to look at equity, they wanted us to look at all of them. Try to do this in a soundbite. When somebody asks you the simple question, I live here and I'm going to drive here, let's make it simple, 100 miles, what is it going to cost me? Now, as soon as you go down the road as saying, well, what type of vehicle do you drive? How many people are traveling with you? What time of day are you traveling? And what road are you going to be on? You lost them. I mean, this doesn't work. So what did we end up with? Something that looked more like this. That was just a vehicle classification times the distance traveled. And vehicle classification, obviously, they're on the road, so it was a vehicle. So you could say that's one, but then there were other characters that they wanted to look at, the size of the vehicle. And it's interesting because notice I don't say weight there. I say length, width, height, not weight, because when we were looking at light vehicles, if it's under 10,000 pounds, the amount of damage that's done to the road is negligible. It's only when we start getting above 10,000 pounds. So that's why many times you have truck charges and weights, because those are the vehicles above 10,000 pounds that do proportionally more and more damage to the road depending on the weight and depending on the suspension system and depending on the axle loading. Nothing simple in this area. The other things that it could be is the vehicle classification, the engine type, hybrid, diesel, could be a classification. And if you're doing length, width, and height, then probably somebody with a Winnebago is going to pay more than a Prius or a smart vehicle. So, those are different things that could be considered, and then distance traveled. And I bring that up because one of the central issues about distance traveled is that a mile is not a mile is not a mile. How are you going to measure it? And what usually comes out is saying somewhere along the line you have to define what is a legal measurement device. That's why on your house your electric meter is a legal measurement device for measuring that kilowatt. And one of the things that you have to think of is there's different ways to do that. Like in Germany, what they wanted to do is make sure that every time somebody went down a segment of road, that was measured the same way. And that may sound silly, but when we did testing in Hong Kong, we sent 26 vehicles out over the same identical route. Each one came back with a different distance, even though they all drove the same exact route. Because when you pass a car or you take a turn wider, this is like running track. You're putting on extra mileage. And what people have sometimes a problem with is says, wait a minute, I drive from home to work, it's 20 miles, and your system's telling me one day it was 18, another one it was 18, it was 22. I mean, I don't know, your system's not working right. And sometimes you have to back into saying, no, it's actually working absolutely correctly. It's just that you're driving slightly different each day. And so the Germans worried about that, said, let's do it by segment. So they measured it on their motorways between ramp 1, ramp 2, ramp 3, and then they charged you for the segment when you entered the segment, so it was always charged the same way. I bring it up because it's part of this policy that you have to think about how we're going to measure it and what's going to be a legal measuring device.
Can I ask interject a question here? So, I think one of the very wise things that was said early on was, I think you said it in this presentation, is that it doesn't have to be perfect. So one of the things and as a policy wonk, I love this sort of thing, but I also found myself asking myself a few times, back when I was a kid, we did significant figures in physics, and you realize that it does no good to measure one thing with calipers down to the micrometer if other factors are simply too coarse because the noise outweighs the signal. So you actually go with the thing you can measure the least well. That's just the way you go. So what I'm curious about in this context is, do we know what we measure the least well? Because once we establish what's the thing that's the least objective, we could end up deciding that we don't care about whether the odometer is 2% off versus the GPS being 1% off, because other things completely overwhelm it. So I'm actually, and of course, the one thing I would not want to skimp on is privacy, of course, so I am biased, and you all know that. But there seems like there's a lot of things in the policy equation where you would, as a super data miner, like measure everything really, really accurately and gain a lot of data. But at the end of the day, maybe it doesn't actually make the revenue generation picture any better. So it would be great to just sort of figure out a way to just stop looking at things that aren't going to actually. So, but of course, I have no way to know how to do that. But it's just, I mean, like you were talking about. Well, the distance is not the same, but I don't know that anyone really cares whether it's, except for the Germans.
Well, and Lee, the Germans were a special situation because essentially in the committee that was drafting the legislation, there were 18 people, and 17 of the 18 were lawyers.
Well, that's the other problem.
There was the being married to a lawyer, I could say that was the first mistake. I will also add to that, to what Lee was just saying. One of the things I learned at that conference in D.C. earlier this week was that as this moves into the commercial sector, to where you say you have an open source, for those people that do opt in, the privacy issue isn't a concern for them. It becomes a very much a commercialized element, to where I think there was like Verizon Telematics, which is a company that I believe got the Oregon contract.
It's one of the Oregon.
One of the Oregon, and they've designed theirs very open source. So really anybody can create apps, almost like an app store. It was pretty fascinating to learn the amount of information, and it almost got to the point to where if you agreed to it, you wouldn't have to pay to drive at all, because they just want to know where it is you're going and how you're going, because that's part of their whole marketing thing. So it's the same thing when you check the I accept button on Google. If for those of you that do that, they're actually making more money off of you than you realize. So there's, again, I think, possibilities open source, again, for those that opt in. But at the same time, being very cognizant of the privacy issues, we always need to make sure, whatever we discuss here, that the public has the ability to check the box saying, I want nothing to do with it.
And, when you're measuring and your multiplier then gets to be a penny and a half in Oregon, or 1.9 in Washington State, you start finding that that 1.5 difference on the odometer really isn't a big thing. It's not going to be a big swing. I mean, even the total cost for the end of the month and the test that was run, and it was run both in Oregon and Washington, that people were basically very happy with the bill, and one of the things that shocked them was that it was so small. In fact, it was one of those things that basically, because the bills are so small, economically, when you're running operations, you don't even want to do a monthly bill. It kind of works better to do it quarterly. So, I mean, those things do come in. But answering your question, what was the most inefficient one that we found? Measuring a gallon of gas.
Really? That's interesting.
I'll test anybody here. Go to the hardware store, get yourself a gallon container, or better yet, a 2-gallon container. Go to the pump, fill it up, and see what the pump says they just charged you and how much fuel you just put into the tank. I just did that the other day for trying to fill up a tank Remember, I'm in Virginia, so there was a snowblower that I had to fill up, and filling up my snowblower. I had a 2-gallon tank, but I got charged for $2.5 gallons that went into that 2-gallon tank, and it didn't expand. It was the same tank that I had when I started. So the calibration on gas pumps isn't the best, and the certification program on that isn't the best. So
Yeah, and when it's cold, you should get more gas.
yeah, I should. Yeah, I should be able to cold fill it. That's right. And it was cold. So anyway, there's. I'm raising these because these are going to go hand in hand as we start talking later on in the program. Again, remember, it's a wicked problem. Everything interconnects. What you heard in New Zealand and your point, keep it simple. We're better off keeping it simple. And again, we talk Eurovignettes. These are these little tags or stickers. These are the countries in Europe that are doing it, either for cars or cars and trucks. And part of that ANPR, that's auto number plate recognition, we would call it a license plate reader in the U.S., but they call them number plates. So it was an auto number plate reader in Hungary. So that essentially, when you bought the sticker, the enforcement was they had cameras along the motorway. They read license plates, and if your license plate didn't show up as having bought the sticker, then you could be cited. The other thing they did was don't stop and get coffee or something, because one of their favorite places of checking license plates and stickers is at all the rest stops. So that was another part of their enforcement system. And future vignettes, we know the UK is looking at doing that for trucks. Belgium's going for cars. Poland is looking at doing it for cars and trucks. Distance charges on private cars, again, New Zealand, it was for diesel and ultra-fuel vehicles. They're actually looking at moving to petrol vehicles, but they need to improve their system. They've been very interested in what you're doing here in California and what's been going on in Oregon. Oregon, on their open system, at least what they refer to as an open system, and part of that was so that they could do choice in methods. Because if you have an open system and you have standards, then other people can build to those standards. And that's one of the differences between an open and a closed system. And then, of course, this whole idea of commercial account managers that we touched on earlier. And I've got Oregon highlighted there on the map. All the other states that are shaded, they've either addressed policy or are addressing policy or have done some studies and look into a road charge or a road usage charge or a VMT charge. So it's not, it's not organic to the West Coast. There's lots of states looking at it. In fact, I was just looking at legislation this morning that's in draft in Florida. So there's quite a few places looking at it besides yourself.
And I should mention, as we heard from Congressman Earl Blumenauer in D.C., H.R. 679 is called the Road Usage Charge Pilot Project. And we'll make sure this gets emailed out to everybody. But it's fascinating. Here's a member of Congress that, as I was sharing with Eric Thronson earlier, pretty much has modeled SB 1077 and is introducing it as federal legislation and throwing, it looks like $30 million into the pot in federal money to help study this and encouraging states to look at it, trying to move the model away from this per gallon taxed.
So you're not alone, I guess, is the message of this slide. And, if I had to pick out 10 lessons learned from around the world, you heard the first one from Shannon. Establish the policy and the legislative framework. Work from there. Understand and refine your objectives. Make sure you're sharing it with the public and you're transparent. You could read these. I don't need to read these to you. I think the interesting one is the fourth one down, which is choice. And certainly that starts with New Zealand. They had a great positive impression of government because they were offering choice. Because prior to that, you only had the government system. When they introduced commercial account managers, the vehicle owners actually turned the other way and said they liked the idea that they had choice. And that was something that we heard over and over again in Oregon in town hall meetings, and the same thing in Washington State, that the public, and think about it, in our consumer system, that's exactly what we have is choice. And I don't care if you're buying orange juice at the supermarket. You want it with pulp, without pulp. You want it concentrate, unconcentrated. You want it fresh. Think about your options that are just there on the shelf. We're imbued with that with our commercial system and our economic system. So why wouldn't we want to carry that over to this? And I say that only as a suggestion. There's one there that's minimize exemptions. Probably the most difficult thing that we've ever had has been exemptions. We addressed exemptions in Singapore and for their electronic road pricing, and they took a very strong, firm look that nobody was exempt. Even government vehicles were required to pay it. When we did this in London, we ran into all sorts of problems because everybody wanted an exemption. And in fact, in some cases, from an equity standpoint, the exemptions worked just the opposite, because we gave exemptions for health service, but you had to be a member of the British Health Service. But people that were on contract cleaning the hospitals or supplying them with food were not part of that exemption. And they were the ones from the lower income classes that really were the most disadvantaged by having to pay the charge coming in. So that wasn't very equitable in my mind. And then again, enforcement and legal aspects of the process are critical. But the last bullet, keep it simple. I mean, when you're thinking about this, it's easy to design something, put it together, and say, go do it, and it's complicated. It's a lot harder to put it together simple. So if you keep that one last bullet in mind, to keep things simple, the process and everything and the tests will work much, much better.
Another question?
Certainly.
And your comment about the road charging and the effect of that exemption on the poor made me ask, do you have any generalizations from experience as to how different approaches are? Is it possible to say sort of like this approach is generally unfavorable to those of lower incomes, or this is generally likely to be more fair across socioeconomic? I just have no idea, but I'm just wondering how you would factor that.
It's obviously done, Lee, on an individual basis.
I have to.
Yeah, and the situation's going in. But I mean, take your mind out of transportation for a minute, because I think that's the beauty of this committee, is that you've got a lot of disciplines, and actually not having transportation people is a benefit. Think about how we do other utilities, gas, electric. I mean, if you're a senior citizen, you get your first so many therms free. There's ways that, the one thing that I found in this is that in a lot of countries, there are ways to do this, and it's only up to your own imagination in order to try to get some equity back into it. But when I worked on an equity committee for federal highways, trying to put out some sort of guidelines on equity, that's difficult. And it really comes to individual situations. And even if you think it's equitable, somebody will come up with and point out that it's actually not working in that way, in actual context. But the one thing that we try to use as a guiding light is the new system more equitable than the old system, doing it holistically. If you actually look at the equity in the gas tax, and comments were made here earlier, it's not very equitable. I can opt out, if I'm rich enough and I can afford it, I can buy that Leaf or that electric vehicle. I'm opting out of the system. Low income doesn't have that, and we haven't had them long enough where they turn into second and third hand cars to get down to the lower income brackets. And I'm not sure if it is the second or third car, if you can even want it. I'm not sure at that point what it'll be for batteries and other things that are going to be a problem. But
May I comment on that?
Yeah,
when
more.
focusing on the equity, you're asking a question about the equity of the incidence of the charges. In transportation finance, much larger equity issues are associated with where the money is spent. So, for example,
I think both. I think I
Yeah.
take your point. I think
if you the gas tax is inequitable by itself, but if you spend a lot of it on public transit, it becomes progressive rather than regressive.
That's a great
Yeah.
point.
So,
And I was thinking about public transit as well, because many folks who can't afford to own a car will rely on public transit, and thus, for them at least directly, a gas tax doesn't.
Well, in a way, that doesn't make any sense, though. I mean, globally, it might make sense, but if I'm an individual who commutes a great distance in an old car and I use a lot of gasoline, and I'm paying a lot of gas tax, and you're throwing it all into transit, onto the roads, it's not going to do me a damn bit of good to have it all in transit, because I'm still driving my car great distances, and so you're sort of doubling down on the inequity.
there are two very vigorously competing themes when people debate equity. One is it fair in terms of does the user get the benefits, which is the point you just made, and the other is does it discriminate against the poor, which is a separate question, but they're interrelated, and they're both at work here.
Right. I think we're both there, and you're right to raise the other one. Yeah.
And and just going back, Lauren, to the point about you're spot on. I mean, what we have seen in data, and I'm analyzing some data that I analyzed in the Washington D.C. area. Essentially, we say the public transport was there for the lower income groups, but when I have to take my family somewhere, the cost for each member getting on the bus to have a ticket was more expensive than what I was going to pay in gas tax. So a lot of times the option was we're going to take the car because it was cheaper because we're all going to the same spot. So, in some cases, we think, we're putting the public transport there for the lower income groups, but in some cases, the cost of the tickets and cost of the fares, unless we're subsidizing in some way, is very expensive for them.
I think there's, on the equity issue, when you talk about equity, you by definition expand your definition for the purpose of the transportation system to things like access to jobs, access to school, education, health care. So if you have a 90-minute commute that has an area that's this big, and you have a new transit system that allows the transit system to cover in 90 minutes that much land use, you're expanding the opportunities for people to find jobs in a much larger area, and the number of jobs that are available in those larger areas can lead to social goals, social policy goals. So that's an argument for transit in the sense that if people have a goal of getting people out of poverty and having more income, transportation is literally an avenue to accomplish that. So you have to design your transportation system to do that. And how much influence does the pricing have on that? And I had another question for you on the other issues, lessons learned. When people are going through this, were there countries or other states that have developed what I call transition plans, and how did they go about doing that?
Great question.
Because we didn't hear that.
No.
I don't know if I was missing. I just got out of the budget committee, so I'm kind of like hitting my head against, so I'm getting that policy discussion.
Well, we're glad that you left the committee to come.
3 hours there and then come here.
We're glad that you left there to come here to get a breath of fresh air.
I hope so.
A mental breath of fresh air. The issue of transition has not
Transition, I think, is very important.
Oh, it is. And it's interesting because even like in Oregon, there really wasn't a transition plan other than this idea that we start with a limited number of volunteers and then expand it. But that came out in the legislation. It wasn't something that was planned. The only place I know that we've really looked at transition planning, and there was some good work done up in Washington State in their study on transition planning. And in those cases, they looked at it then got modeled into the business case to look at what the cost of those transitions are, because that's your almost most expensive period, because you have so many people on the old system, yet so many people on the new system. And one of the transition plans that seemed to have favor, especially with the automotive manufacturers, is pick a model year and just say vehicles after this model year going forward above this mileage was, meant to be to them the fairest, because then it didn't affect their sales and people can make the decision rather than getting stuck with one.
A few years ahead of time,
Yes,
like give them like 3 years or whatever,
correct.
and then transition beyond that. So like if we adopted, say, legislation in 2 years from now or 3 years from now, then we'd probably have a transition period after that of 2 to 3 years, and then we'd be up to speed after 3 years in terms of a transition period, correct?
Yes, and
I'm
we'll,
looking at it from my standpoint of how I'm, since by that time I won't be in the legislature, hopefully. See, I don't know. Maybe something will happen, but I think the idea of having a good transition plan is very important. I think, and even though we're kind of in our minds thinking about, oh, this won't happen for a while, I think we have to start talking about transition planning, Mr. Chairman. So I think,
Absolutely.
I think that should be on the table here.
Well, one of the things that I think as we look at this is not going to happen overnight, as the Senator says. And the reality is we're hearing the Speaker's proposal and the discussion that took place both at Senate Trans and Assembly Trans this week, where folks are recognizing there is a serious funding deficiency. And so something's going to have to be done on the interim. And that interim needs, this is just my own personal opinion, it needs to be demonstrated to the public that interim is going to get phased out while this other one transitions in. And we've already seen the numbers. You know darn well mileage by the gallon, taxes charged by the gallon, is phasing out on its own just by higher mileage, at least for passenger vehicles.
Yeah, and you're not like Washington in many ways, but one of the things that was a limiting factor in Washington State was they have a heavy bonding of their gas tax and so they still have to pay for the bonds. So it goes like to 2043 before they paid off the existing bonds without adding new ones. So there's a certain amount of concern on the part of the treasurer about how he was going to pay the bonds, and the bonds were very much in the bonding were very much tied to the gas tax. So it was almost like they have to keep the gas tax. So the transition had to address both over a longer period of time.
I think what we have that's maybe a little different than other states, I believe, is we have this global warming policy that says basically, and there's a bill right now that's very explicit about it, sponsored by the President of the California Senate, that the gasoline carbon fuel use will decrease, mandated by 50% by 2030. So by 2030, that will reduce essentially gasoline by 50%. So that's, and you can do your projections, could see how, I saw your little chart here.
Right.
So how does that play into our situation? Maybe by that time we won't have any roads left. They'll all be falling apart, and we'll have to fly on little devices to fly us around or something.
I mean, I can't.
Maybe there'll be another way to transport ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, your situation is very much like what we saw in actually the UK, where there was a very active policy to get people off, fossil fuels, and a big push by government to get into very efficient vehicles very quickly.
But we're also drying ourselves up in terms of our ability to pay for things.
Yes, and as Stephen knows, and with they've done great reports to try to say it makes a difference if that vehicle, especially the lighter, more fuel-efficient vehicles, have a good road to drive on, because if they don't, their operating costs go up dramatically. So there's another dimension to that too.
Jack, I have a question. Out of all the road user programs, what had the most effective enforcement mechanism to prevent evasion out of all of them? Or your two favorites?
I'm sorry. The background, I'm trying to run through my mind as to probably the Swiss program. And a lot of the Swiss program had a lot to do with the way that it was enforced and the way that the data was looked at.
Was that through audits?
They did it through audits, but they also did it a lot by sending in the files that they could look at what the odometer said versus what the GPS said. They had a great system automatically to cross-reference and make sure there was no cheating being done. When we looked at it, actually, I think there were some good looks at it in Washington State, but one of the things there, and it's going to sound funny, that because the gas tax stayed in place, and understand while you have the gas tax and you're doing a road charge, what they were doing and what they're doing in Oregon is they're basically having to say, okay, based on the miles you drove, we're giving you a credit on your account against the assumed number of miles or assumed number of gallons that you purchased. So they're giving you back money as a credit on the invoice. Now, that actually works as a great enforcement mechanism, because if you want to cheat on your numbers, you're still paying the gas tax. So you're only cheating yourself. So in effect, it's a self-correcting policy for the miles on people that are still in a gas or diesel-driven vehicle.
Okay. I had another comment on the congestion pricing. It was on pricing that was mentioned there. I mean, this is just a statement representing the Trucking Association. I mean, it just doesn't work for the trucking industry. I mean, you could take, for example, we're kind of at the mercy of our customers, and you have to have businesses shift delivery times and have personnel come and receive it at different times of the night. They're in the morning where, it just doesn't work out for a lot of businesses. Take, for example, the Port of Oakland. They're open from 8 to 4, and you get dumped out into 3 major interstates right there, and you're stuck in traffic, so there's really no flexibility or times for where a truck can come in and out of the port. So that's one of those things that we always keep an eye on when they have those regional cordon pricing schemes coming or programs coming out. It's extremely concerning to us because we really don't have anything we can't do anything about it.
No, you're absolutely right. And when they have tried to do some of that in like Stockholm and other places, what they found was that it actually had a negative effect on other parts of the environment for noise abatement, because now trucks were trying to do deliveries outside of the main periods of time, which meant they're unloading that truck in a downtown city with residents living above the stores at midnight or 2 in the morning, which the residents didn't quite like. So, again, all of this is interconnected. That's why this is such a wicked problem.
Thank you.
Okay, other questions, comments? All right, go back to Carrie. And we are going to move on to the communications piece of this.
As I mentioned earlier when we were discussing Agenda Item 6, there are 2 parts to the communication strategy, the one for the TAC and then the one greater communication strategy for the deployment of the pilot program. Colleen Gant from the D'Artagnan team will be providing an overview of that communication strategy.
Hi, everyone. So it sounds like we're going to go on a scan tour. Who's going to be going to New Zealand and Hong Kong in this group? So it's great to be back in my home state. I grew up in San Diego. I was born and raised in California. I bring the perspective of PRR, a national communications firm. We do all aspects of this communications with the road charge, and including market research and public affairs and public relations. We've been around for 30 years. I think we specialize in the area of inclusive outreach in particular. We were founded as a minority and women-owned firm, so that's something that's been high on our radar, and I'd say we're nationally recognized for that. I'm very interested in a couple of things that were mentioned. The Caltrans 30-pager on Transportation 101, or the 2-pager, because it exists, and I think part of our responsibility in projects like this is pushing out that information and making sure that people see that, because as we look at these different ways to fund transportation, it's our responsibility to educate the public on what's happening now. So very much, you'll hear that a lot as I'm kind of sharing some thoughts with you. So I'm going to be addressing the area in your bill, that the tax charge that is on gathering public comments on issues. And so the information that you gather as a technical advisory committee will definitely help inform the communications program that'll be part of the pilot program. And you mentioned branding for the road charge and as a national, as you know, as the program. And I will mention that we did do a couple of focus groups in that area and went through all kinds of names, you know, a list of probably 10, 12 different things to call it. And in the end, the people in the focus group came up with road usage charge. I was like, could we not get a little bit more creative than that? But the deal was is they wanted to call it what it is. Don't call it something gimmicky and cute, but call it what it is. Describe it. So, all right, here's my, oh, good. So definitely the two-way dialogue is key, and you'll hear that theme running throughout, is that, I would say we're not trying to get people to believe that this is a good thing. But truth be told is once the facts are out there about a road charge program, many of the skeptics they turn around their opinion because they hear the facts, not PR spin, but the true facts of how a program like this works, and oftentimes their opinion is turned around. So I'll be basing some of my thoughts here today on a couple pieces of research. One you've heard about, and many of you probably participated in this, the Southern California Association of Governments, SCAG, Express Travel Study. My copy is well worn. It's a great study and definitely has some common themes that we also heard in Oregon, who's been through 2 pilot programs, and now I'm working with them with ODOT to implement their program and get the 5,000 volunteers and all of the communications that goes along with that. So we'll kind of call upon that. In addition to PRR, also worked in Washington State on the traffic choices, which was one of the very earliest road charge pilot programs. It was very elementary, but one of the earliest. So we find that a lot of these misconceptions that are listed here in the slide, the fairness, the privacy, costly and complicated to operate, double taxation, and a deterrent to purchasing hybrid or EV vehicles are common themes that happen in a lot of this research that's being done. I will mention that there is a great national research program going on right now on road charge, and that's being run by the National Highway Research Program, and they're doing a big literature review of all of the existing research. So the report, I think you will be very interested in the report out from that, which should be, I don't know, in June? June. You knew that.
The project is being done at San Jose State University.
Yes.
And the principal investigator could probably attend one of our meetings.
That would be great, I think. Yeah, I think you'll learn a lot about that.
San Jose State, Asha.
Yes. Yes, Aisha. NCHRP study on that. So yeah, you'll find that really interesting, I think. So an example that we have that we actually did in Oregon, and this is the one on the bottom is statistically valid. I'll start with the one on the top, though. When we did a statewide listening tour in the state of Oregon, we found that when people came in the door, that they were 59% of people, let's see, sorry, I'm looking here. I'm trying to look in my glasses. 41% of the people were supportive of a road charge program when they walked in, and believe me, people walked in with their arms folded, and it was clear, there weren't a lot of supporters of the idea. But by the time they left, we did an exit survey of all of the attendees in each of the different 10 or so locations around that state, and found that 59% were supportive afterwards, which is quite a significant increase. But where you get the statistically valid increase, and we went up by 1 whole point, and in research that's, according to our research department, that's a big deal, was in the telephone survey, which is a statistically valid way of gathering information, as you know. So only 15% were supportive of a road charge on that telephone survey when we started at the beginning of it, and after about a 6-minute conversation, not very long at all, and these are like telephone researcher people that aren't experts in the area of road charge, shared a little bit of information, cleared up some, presented some facts. We went up to 24%. So went up a whole point in terms of people that found an acceptable way to pay for transportation.
But still only 1 out of 4 like the idea.
Correct. And so, yeah, that's right. So that's what we look at as communications people as an opportunity to inform people and educate.
But you did. It's not that you didn't inform the other 75%. You did inform them.
Yes.
They just didn't buy it.
Right.
So what did
Well,
you learn from that?
So,
I mean, was that considered a? And I'm not trying to be
yeah.
glib.
No, I understand. So what we
Was
learned.
it considered a success to go from 15 to 24?
Yes. So the researchers involved thought that was remarkable, that we went up a whole point. So that part of it was deemed a success. So, it's all in how you slice and dice this. So 6 minutes with a person who's not an expert in this area of road charge was able to bring it up to that. What we found in focus groups and in the statewide listening tour, when we had a longer time to talk with people, and that's why I call it a two-way dialogue, because you keep going back and forth, and listening like you're doing here today, and listening to all the different points and trying to share the facts with people. It doesn't happen in a 6-minute conversation. So we found that we could go up on 1 point, but I think it takes longer than a 6-minute conversation. But to answer your question, what we learned is with a little bit of information, we got a pretty good increase. That's a little nugget that I took away from that.
From 1 out of 6 to 1 out of 4.
Yeah. In that particular example.
It's a very optimistic way of looking at things. I can see.
Right.
Communications.
Right. But then if you look at the one above, though, that one went from 41% to 59%. So that's a larger group, as I say. So the longer you have to talk with people, I think it makes a bigger difference.
Why did the in-person folks come in higher than the telephone?
Well, that's interesting. So, and as you relate it to, for example, the SCAG study versus what's going on in Oregon. Remember, Oregon has had 2 pilot programs already and quite a bit of media coverage on the topic. So that's one of the conclusions that I've come to, is that when people walk in the door, and I will say probably, well, first of all, the general public in Oregon is more informed on the topic. And then in the statewide listening tour, I bet we got, half the people or so were even more informed people, the real interested types that were already studied up on the topic. So in terms, yeah, please.
What was the sample size for telephone survey?
400. Yeah.
Is it possible that some of these guys were tired of listening to this other person and said, agree, so, and that's how the number got
Possibly, but we try to keep them pretty short. We try to keep them for that very reason. There's a science to how long these things go and how many questions are palpable to people. So that's a good point, but I think that the researchers usually design them so that won't happen.
Keep that in mind when we're on our 24th meeting with this.
That's right. Okay. Yeah, and I only have 12 slides, and I'm trying to whip through them pretty quick.
I want to add to that, though, because I think, Lauren, the questions that you're making are very valid.
Yeah.
Yesterday at the Senate Transportation and Housing Committee hearing, one of the people making testimony was Commissioner Jim Arp. He sits on the Transportation Commission, but in his day job, he's the head of the California Alliance for Jobs. And the Alliance for Jobs has done an extensive amount of survey in cooperation with the Transportation California, looking at transportation issues in the state. They have just completed a series of focus groups, and so this gets the exit survey is, of course, after sitting in a 2-hour meeting
Yes.
or something, and the information that's shared there. But Jim was making the point that in the focus groups, there's a chance to actually talk to people and engage. It's a different environment. You get to engage in a dialogue with them, and you can answer specific questions that they may have. Obviously, as you well know, in a telephone survey, you're canned questions and you're going through things and all of that stuff. There isn't a lot of time. Jim's comment that I thought was very instructive after he discussed some of the focus group results is that if we had a chance to talk to every voter in California, to have that kind of a discussion.
Dialogue.
You're not going to get, some people are just absolutely not going to
Yes.
be there, but he thought that with that kind of dialogue, that we would really have a good chance of making the case for additional transportation funding. Now, that comes from a transportation advocate, and I happen to agree with him because I'm one of those advocates as well. But it's to the point that you're making, that if you have an opportunity to really sit down and talk to somebody and communicate and answer their specific questions, you can get an entirely different sort of a result. That's not to say that if we sit down with everybody in California and have a conversation on road charges, that they're all going to be saying, oh, this
Right.
is a wonderful thing. In fact, many people may harden their
Yes.
opposition and their concerns. But I think that communication is the key, and I think that's
Yeah.
the point you're trying to make. If you have an
Absolutely.
opportunity to communicate with people, you're at least going to get an informed response, or certainly a more informed response.
Exactly, and that's why you hear us talk a lot about, a facts-based campaign and sharing the facts, not, as I say, the PR spin, but the facts of how a program like this works, and people, start to learn more about it. They start to be a little bit more supportive. At least that's what I've observed so far. It's fairly new. I mean, not according to Jack. It started in 1964, but the more, modern ones are relatively new
And reading what
to learn from.
what you've presented, and also in a way in responding to what Lauren said,
Yeah.
people don't understand the gas tax or the current mechanism very
Exactly.
well. And so part of their opposition, when you interpret that 15 to 24% change, that involves understanding what we're doing now as well as what we're
Absolutely.
proposing. And you say, well, it's not very impressive if we only get up to a quarter. But my guess is that just as many people don't understand the gas tax and wouldn't approve of it either, but it's in existence. So
Right.
we really have an uphill battle. But,
Right,
but
we really do.
information-
Yep, and on that point, what we found is that, we talked to people during the telephone survey and found that one thing people definitely want is improvements to their transportation, but they don't want to pay a tax for it, and the idea of a road charge also initially doesn't sound that great either. Well, how do you think we're going to pay for it? And I'll share some ways that people think that we pay for it right now. This point here is that good information informs not only strong strategies, but informed decisions. And so the more information that we can offer people allows them to make a more informed opinion, kind of to your point that you just said, that people didn't have enough information perhaps in that telephone survey and didn't get how we pay for transportation. Now, the more we can educate people, people can make an informed opinion on something. So you are going to collect a lot of good information during this technical advisory committee process as well. We will, I can tell you from experience in Oregon, many times we have had to go back to the information such as what you're going to gather, information from branding focus groups. You'll go through this whole process of a branding research. So what do we want this program to be called? What do we want it to, what feelings do we want it to evoke? How do we want it to come across? Is it, scientific? Is it breezy? Is it this? Is it that? What's the tone of the brand of this program? And so you get the whole thing done, you develop the brand, and then halfway down the process, a transportation agency or another organization starts saying, well, we can't word something like that. We need to say, the Department of Transportation has, and you say, well, we kind of remember what the people told us during the research that we did is they don't want it to come across as bureaucratic. So let's try to soften this up a little bit. So we will refer to the information that you gather during this process. You also will rely on the information that is gathered through research to help you make good decisions. And then finally, as I said, we're going to need the research to inform our own communication strategies. What are people's misconceptions? How are people feeling about road charging? And do they even know what they're paying now in gas tags? So often what we think we know about transportation funding is just not correct. So the media doesn't really help with that too much. There's all kinds of messages out there. One, we know people don't know that much about transportation funding, but the things they do read sometimes aren't even that accurate. In the SCAG study, it was interesting to one of the points that was brought up earlier. 1 out of 10 people in each focus group that was conducted even knew that they paid a gas tax. 1 out of 10. And a few mentioned that the gas tax is essentially a hidden tax, and some even liked it that way. And in fact, also in Oregon, when we were doing the statewide listening tour, someone said, "Well, you know, the gas tax, it's just so easy. I don't notice it." And so I put the gas in my tank and I just pay and I go. And we said, "Well, what if you knew that you were actually paying more in gas tax than you would pay in a road charge?" I don't know. I don't know if I'd like that because it's just so easy. And I thought, so what we're finding is that, and in talking to people, is, you know, maybe you'll get a statement in the mail. Oh, that seems like it's difficult. That's a change. That's a different way of approaching transportation funding. But it allows you to be more informed. And we've seen it in other utilities. Electric bills, it comes and it shows you how much you're using as compared to how much your neighbors are using. And what do? We start turning off the lights in the rooms. We start conserving electricity. Well, once you know how much you drive, how much you spend on gas, and your driving behaviors, not everyone will make a change, but some may actually make a change. Maybe they'll drive less. Maybe they'll take one less trip to the store during the week, you know, and you go back and forth all week long. So it just allows people to be a bit more informed. And, notice so this is in the SCAG study. This is where a lot of people thought that was the source of how we pay for transportation. A vehicle registration, traffic tickets, federal and state city taxes, stimulus funds, property and income taxes, cigarette taxes, taxi and shuttle fees, and the Melrose Act, which we found is, all over. And then also an impression from the SCAG study.
Proportions or numbers or percentages.
I have the study right here. I could look that up.
Were these common responses or were they occasional responses?
They were the more common responses, Marty.
Because he was actually involved in the study. I read it, but I've got it here, and I think we could provide it to people to look at. Oh, you already got it. Okay, great. And then one thing we found in that study that was kind of unique in California was that when people saw road construction signs, they felt that must mean we've got plenty of money to pay for transportation, and that seems like a logical thing, but again, not really true.
We see the roads get fixed in Berkeley every time there's an election.
Okay.
We need more elections.
That helps. Yeah, we need more elections.
That's when the potholes get built.
Yeah. Interesting. Interesting. Another misconception we've heard in a national study. This national study is called Building America's Future. We saw that many people actually thought that the gas tax increases on an annual basis. And in fact, we West Coasters, over on the right there, really believe that line. 67% of us are thinking that goes up every year. So here's just a few common questions. You'll come up with your own list, or through this process, we'll have a list of frequently asked questions. There's, pages of frequently asked questions. And what I have found is that probably about 75% of them, 3/4, are pretty common amongst the states and the countries and everything. But then there's about 1/4, and that's just my rough estimate, that are really more specific to the actual state. And so it'll be interesting to go through that process here with this technical advisory committee to get to what those specific questions are. But as you look at these, how much will I be charged? We can't answer that question right now. We know, in Oregon it's 1.5 cents a mile. We know in Washington they're thinking about 1.9 cents a mile, but that doesn't mean anything about, what we're going to pay here in California. So some of these questions we just won't know the answers, but some we do. Will this be a double tax? No, it won't, and we can explain that now. And these are just, why not raise the gas tax? Is it fair to rural drivers? So I know we have someone, Randall, here from representing the rural counties here in California. So, interestingly, with some of our research, we found that the rural drivers tend to drive less or use less gas. And you're going to be like, oh my gosh, you're feeding me a line here, that's for sure. But what it goes back to is that, the rural driver might have to drive further to get to the doctor or further to get where they need to go, but they take less trips. The urban drivers are going back and forth to the grocery store. And they also sit in traffic longer. And they're burning gas and paying gas tax when their car is not even moving or moving very slowly. So it's interesting. When you present that to people, the light bulb goes off. Well, that makes sense. And then you have the data to back it up. So these are facts. It is not a spin. And people, feel that more educated and say, hey, well, this does actually make sense. And I'll never forget being in one of our elected officials, he left, but being in a rural city in Oregon, Ontario, Oregon. They even have a different time zone than the rest of Oregon. They're on the east side. But the legislator walked in, and people were asking about rural drivers, and he came in and he said, Harry and all of you that drive trucks, you should be the first one to sign up because you're going to save money. And everybody, and they heard it from a reliable source, their own elected official, and he was right. And I think they'll probably be lined up to be the first ones to sign up. And that last point at the bottom from the media, again, it's a constant, I won't say battle. We have to keep the media close at bay, briefing them, talking with them, probably want them to participate in the study because right now most of them are using the term tracked. And as we've been hearing throughout the day, we don't want to track you. We just want to measure the miles that you're using, measure the miles that you're going, not really what destination you're going to. So as mentioned, research in all these different locations is very similar, and access to information is empowering. And we may see, like we said, changes in behavior, but also change is hard for people. It's not easy. When we started buying more energy efficient light bulbs, well, now everyone's got probably at least one in their home. But that wasn't an easy thing. They look ugly. We don't want to put that in our light. But then we realized the advantage to it over time, and we've all got it now. Maybe not all of us, but almost all of us. More energy efficient lawnmowers, low flow toilets, the front load washers. Those are things that were hard to get used to, but we realized that, there are better ways of doing things. And so this sort of market transformation is likely to happen with this as well. Who knows? But there's research. San Jose State was already mentioned. Doing a per mile rate varies based on vehicle emissions. Oh, this is one of Jack's. 43% nationally. And let's see. You might want to describe that one, Jack. But San Jose State University's, I'll just read it because make sure I get it right, conducts an annual survey of the public's attitude towards transportation funding. In 2014, survey respondents opposed mileage-based charges by a 4-to-1 margin. But the support improved when assuming that the per mile rate varies based on vehicle emissions, 43% nationally and 46% in the West. So Indiana University is doing research, Washington, D.C. People are generally uninformed about the gas tax. I think we'll learn a lot when we get that national NCHRP study that we're going to share with you.
Oh, yeah, the Oregon.
Colorado's doing their research. It's all over. So this was interesting. I think it was Chairman Madaffer who said, we want to hear from people that hate this idea. Or not, they don't hate, but they're skeptics.
Skeptics, yes.
Right. And so when we put together a series of focus groups in Oregon, we called it the haters, but that wasn't the right thing to call it. So the dissenters, and gathered together people that said they really don't like this idea. I know about it, and I just don't like it. And the reason for doing this was to help inform our communications program. It was actually Jim Whitty. He wanted to know, why do people not like this? I want to know the exact reasons. And there's a few of them listed here. We've talked about others, certainly the privacy one, which isn't to be taken lightly. Lack of trust in government. So that's why they're considering that's why they've brought in the private vendors to help collect the revenue. The worry about negative repercussions, disincentive to the hybrid and EV vehicles that we talked about. The road charge would be unfair and inequitable. Road charging program is ill-conceived. Who thought of this great idea anyways? So, and what it does, it just helps us to know what are those things that we need to provide the facts on. Because these are the things that people are saying they just don't like about it. So I thought that was really interesting that you mentioned that. So to get at one of these topics, the disincentive for hybrid vehicle owners, we created an infographic, which is a great way to get a point across. I'm sure you use it here at Caltrans as well, but it's a simple way to get a message across. So we looked at a 2014 Prius versus the 2014 Ford F-150. You can see clearly the miles per gallon of each of those vehicles. Am I doing that? Oh, okay. And that the average, so this is for Oregon, so different from California, but the average number of miles driven in Oregon is 12,962, almost 13,000. And the average gas price there is $2.13. So let's go on to the next piece and keep comparing these two. On the left, we have the Prius, and on the right we have the Ford F-150. So the amount of fuel, again, most people have no idea of how much fuel they're using. But the Prius is using 259 gallons as opposed to the F-150 that's using 720 gallons. So look at the savings that are already happening right now with just the fuel tax. The Prius driver only pays $552 as opposed to $1,500. They're already saving a ton of money. So then when you look at the road use charge, yes, the Prius driver has to pay a little bit more, but overall, they're still saving a lot more than the larger vehicle. And so people were talking about earlier, the maybe low income or people who can't afford to buy an electric vehicle might be sort of what is that word? Like kind of fronting the rest of us in a way, or helping to support the rest. It's not really fair. Of course, there's people who choose to drive the bigger vehicles, but or the less fuel efficient vehicles. So someone who might not be able to afford a more fuel efficient vehicle is paying more. So the interesting thing I thought also from this is that there's a $116 difference for the Prius driver, and in Washington State, they've applied a surcharge of $100 for EV drivers to help make up the difference. So it's really similar. You can just decide to charge the electric vehicle driver $100, and you have your bill here to do the 50 or maybe even more for the electric vehicle drivers.
Colleen, if I could, I just wanted to underscore in this chart that
Absolutely.
Those numbers reflect the total cost of the fuel plus the taxes.
The tax, yes, thank you, Will.
So in the small print down there, you see actually what the state fuel tax is or what the road usage charge is relative to that number. It's normally, when we've done similar exercises in California, we focused on just the cost of the or just the price of the gas tax versus the and that doesn't mean that that's a better way to do it, but I just wanted to make sure that people understood that was the total cost.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's a total price. Exactly. So our job is to correct some of the myths. We've been talking about this, the facts. So unfair to the rural residents, farmers, ranchers. The research has shown no significant difference in road use charges for rural versus urban drivers. I don't want to say if it equals out, but like we talked about, it's probably flipped of what people actually think. An invasion of privacy. So what we find on that, that's a tough one, and I'm not going to try to solve it here, but just in conversation and talking with people, once people learn how it actually works, some people say, gosh, now that you mention it, and, when you talk about the rural roads and the state roads and the private and public roads, maybe I would use the GPS thing. It's interesting. It's not a light bulb doesn't go off and everybody says, oh yeah, I'll sign up. There's no privacy issue. That doesn't happen. But people sort of say, I'm starting to get it a little bit, and they just need people need the reassurance that their data won't be, messed with. And I don't know if we have to give them that assurance, and I don't know if we can 100% yet, but we're getting there, I think. Complicated and costly to operate. There's definitely a threshold. I think Jack was mentioning it. If 1 million people are signed up doing road charge, you could even look at it as multiple states combined. That then the cost goes way down, and the threshold is about 1 million people participating in it. And then we already talked about the deterrent to purchase hybrid vehicles. The answer is clear. It isn't. So interestingly, I thought you guys might find this kind of fun. And we introduced all electronic tolling in Washington State on the 520 bridge. And all electronic tolling was a brand new concept in itself. And so that, again, was going to be a change that people had to make. You have to put it, you've been through this here, of course, but put the transponder in and you have to use it. And so it kind of seemed daunting to people. And so we enlisted the help of a third-party spokesperson, Bill Nye, the science guy, who a lot of people recognize. And, he helped us dispel some myths about this kind of scientific process. And we find that partnering with well-known personalities, whether it was in Ontario, Oregon, where the legislator came in and said, hey, it's going to be good for people who live here, actually. Or it's Bill Nye, the science guy, trying to explain all electronic tolling. Or, I saw a little bit of that in your Carmageddon on the 405 when you had the large closure and you had famous people, chiming in. It's helpful. So all of this, as I mentioned, feeds into our communications program. And so we mentioned a road charging facts campaign or education campaign. It's all about the facts. You guys will want to, as we go through this program, the TAC, and also in the pilot program, we have to refresh and update the public. Leveraging the private partners and the vendors, like I mentioned, some of those partners that we may enlist have a lot of advertising dollars and ways to get messages across to people, and you can actually partner with them when getting the road use charge message out there. Partnering with organizations like AAA, grassroots outreach is key, and a users forum potentially once the pilot program goes so that people can have the two-way dialogue with each other. And we talked about that, and that's how I think that the message is clear, the two-way dialogue. And finally, some of the things that we're going to do here before the pilot even begins are the telephone surveys to baseline people's acceptance of road charging, focus groups, messages and materials. We're working closely with Lucas Communications on a lot of that, and designing an evaluation plan to continually test if our messages are working, and so we can tweak things if we need to be more clear with people.
I had a quick question. What's the timing for some of these things in relation to the work that we'll be doing and to the pilot?
I think Jack and you and Jack wanted to talk about that right now, right? We're going to switch?
No, I can answer that question. Okay. The telephone surveys, we're looking at trying to get that kicked off probably in May, because we need to have the survey questions reviewed by you, and by the time we get the survey questions, you give us responses, then we formulate the survey and plan it. It'll probably be kicked off in about May. Considering the size of California, it's probably going to take a good 6 to 7 weeks to get through the telephone surveys to get sufficient data across the different areas of California. Because, as was mentioned, you have distinct groups and sections of the state that we're going to have to make sure we get a statistically reliable survey out of each one of them.
Right. And when we did 400 in Oregon, we thought here it could be as many as 1,200. There's a bigger state, it's more regions, very different regions. So, I mean, that's just a guess, but you probably would need more than Oregon had.
And then on the focus groups, they'll probably lag that by about a month, because we're going to want to have some of the data from the telephone surveys to then focus on focus groups and roll them behind them. So they're probably looking at that exercise starting in May, rolling out into June, and then June and July for the focus groups, so we can have you the baseline report back in August.
which hopefully will be enough time for you to inform some of your decisions as well. That's the goal.
And that schedule is basically a schedule for, that's tentative. You obviously get a say in that. And, but when you really look at what has to be done to plan it and get it ready, that's a realistic timeline that we can do it.
Okay, any other questions?
Not a question, but more a comment.
Or comments?
Thank you. I appreciate that you're being very careful, Colleen, to say, here's some things we know and we can get information out, and here's some things we don't know because that's what we're all going to be talking about. And,
right.
It seems to me that, there's always a risk, and again, I think you're being careful about this, is that we don't want to send a message that this committee is starting off early in our meeting schedule, coming up with a spin plan. That's not what we're trying to do.
No.
I do think that there's something that should be happening before the telephone surveys, and that is getting out information about the fact that we're here doing this and why is this important. We don't have to be able to answer a lot of the questions to do that, but why do we want to hear from Californians about what they...
I couldn't agree with you more.
Yeah. So I think that's something that maybe, rather than a fact sheet right away about road charging facts, a fact sheet about what's our situation with the gas tax, what are we trying to do about it, and what do we want to hear, what issues do we want to hear from you about, and here's the schedule and whatever.
Absolutely. Yeah, you don't want to do this in closed doors. Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Warren?
Yeah, I've got a question about measuring the success of the messaging, and I'll just use Oregon as a kind of where I was thinking about this. And I understand that the pilot or that the initial step of Oregon is probably going to be early adopters who want to do this anyway, so it's probably not a very good universe. But I got to thinking that you're taking a very skeptical public, obviously, giving them a lot of information and telling them, well, it's going to be okay. The privacy is going to be okay. And I'm oversimplifying. I'm oversimplifying, so just go with me. That it's going to be, that the bureaucracy is not going to be terrible, you're going to have choices, your privacy is not going to be violated, it's going to be efficient, we're not going to waste your money. And so you're just trying to convince people that this is going to be fine, whereas the incumbent system, nobody has to be convinced because they're paying it anyway.
Right.
So I was wondering how you can measure the success of those messages. There's the sort of the gross success, which is that the legislature doesn't revolt and take it away, which is a good indication. But I was wondering if there was some determination that the choices that there are options that the consumers can make can select in how the mileage is being measured, and including going from non-invasive to whatever the other end is. And I'm wondering if there is anybody, first of all, if that was a valid way of looking at it, but if anybody, or even if you know the answer to that question yet, since the project hasn't up and going, but if you could tell whether the messages were either more or less successful than you thought they were going to be based on the uptake of various options that the participants chose. There's a whole lot of caveats, and it may be utterly immeasurable today under the current circumstance, but I just wanted to throw that out there.
Well, that's very good. That's why we have to put together an evaluation plan and how we're going to measure our success. And in terms of measuring the success of the messages, I mean, we have a pretty hefty program of research on this in Oregon. We did the baseline, but we have to go back again. We have 2 more annual surveys to do. We also, one of the things I mentioned is the users forum, and we consider that a piece of our research as well. So once people sign up. So they're signing up for an interest group right now. And we're developing that users forum, and we're actually going to, I am getting to the answer to your question, but we're going to use the interest group as a sort of online focus group for ourselves for a while to test concepts. And the one I always use as an example is your statement. You receive your statement in the mail. How does this make you feel when you see something like this? Or what do you want to know when you receive your statement in the mail? So we're going to use the interest list as a little back and forth initially. That then transitions to people who volunteer to participate in the program and who are selected. And we'll have a users group that in the simplistic view, liken it to like a Facebook page. So you can see my comment, and actually Brady Tactile is the one who showed me an idea for it with the Toyota drivers forum, and so I can put in information about my Toyota and what's going on with me and my experience, and you might put yours in, and we can kind of have a little bit of a back and forth that has to be monitored. But so we look at all of these as data points and forms of research that we can use, some more statistically valid, so an annual telephone survey where you ask the same questions and how are people's opinions changing over time. And then others are more qualitative, where you see these conversations, you have the focus groups. And we will be able to share very shortly our comprehensive research report that we've done so far, just on all these different types of research in Oregon, and we'll continue to share that with you so that you can see what we're learning over time. And right now, that's all I can tell you is that we will use research as a way to guide our further communications and what's working and what isn't, or what's effective. I guess not what's working, but what's effective in providing people with the facts and what's not effective. I hope that answers your question. Are you left still with more questions?
Yeah, but that's not necessarily because...
I think that's the best I can do. Maybe Jack can add to that.
Lauren, the only thing that I'm going to add to it was that when we start looking and working with you on setting up the evaluation plan and the evaluation strategy, what we've used in other tests is survey of the participants and repeated surveys throughout the process. For example, if it runs a year, every quarter running the survey again. Another idea that we can present you with is the idea that in the test, somebody that starts off with a manual method, maybe in the middle of the test, have them change to a different method, and then you're able to see what they thought of both methods. There's different ways that can be done, and a lot of that, I think, is what we'll work with you when we get into the evaluation strategy for the actual test. But there is one point that you brought up that was an excellent point, and that's the microcosm of who we're going to. During the test, we'll have a microcosm of a couple thousand people that are involved with the test, and then when we're done with that, when we're done with that 4,000 or 5,000 people that are done with the test, we've got a great survey base to see how they felt actually having hands-on with the system, which for something this size, I think is going to be fantastic, because that's really one of the areas. I know before the meeting today, Marty and I were talking about that this whole area of public acceptance and public survey hasn't been done really all that well, and we're going to have a great case to do that here. The other side is in the middle of that test, when we get the baseline, going out with another telephone survey during the testing period to the general public to see has the needle moved based on the amount of information that's been printed on and the ongoing test of what they know about it, have the statistics changed. One of the other items that we talked about was the dynamic website, where the comments coming into the website will give us an indication of what people think, because what you'll find out as they become more informed about it, the substance of the questions they put in on the dynamic website and the information they want changes, which gives you an indication that the messaging is getting through.
Excellent. Thank you. So what I want to do now is we're starting to come up against a couple of items on the agenda, moving from communications to really looking at some action items. I've got a couple of notes that I've been taking, but before we move to item 10, I'd like to turn to Senator Bell, who has to take off, but he has an announcement for a meeting coming up.
I wanted to announce that the Senate Transportation and Housing Committee is going to have an informational hearing in Los Angeles on March 13th. It's going to start at 1:30 to 4:30 at the Metro Center, Metropolitan Transportation Authority Metro Auditorium in Los Angeles. And we're going to be discussing the financing of transportation and looking at all these different methods of financing transportation. We're inviting everybody to attend, and hope to see you there, and I'll see you at the next meeting.
Thank you very much. Great to have you here today. So as we look at some of the many issues we've talked about today, I mean, at some point we're going to start providing input to the staff, to the consultant. Just some generic questions that I was thinking of. You know, does this group feel that the TAC and the CTC and the consultant need to move forward now on a messaging effort that, you know, will respond to some of the issues that we've heard here today, to media inquiries, to public inquiries that come along? I get a sense that everybody's in agreement, but I just want to make sure that that's the case. Okay, so I think it's important that we check in. I don't want to just keep having everybody shovel stuff out to you. I just want to see some feedback. So I'm seeing responses. You want to?
Yeah, if I could just add to that, I think I agree with that, and I think it's important. I think also that we need to sort of walk a fine line between, you know, not being responsive and being too underground with what we're doing, and I don't think that's very helpful. I think the more open we are, the better. At the same time, I don't know that we're looking at a major PR offensive. I think we're trying to chart a middle ground path.
Correct. Yeah, middle ground, without a doubt. We don't have anything to sell yet, and that's not our job. Our job is to basically study and to make recommendations. But clearly, there's people that have questions as to what we're up to along the way. And I think, to Steve's point, we need to be responsive to that. And I'm getting a sense of this committee that that's the case.
And gather public input.
And gather public input. And yeah, I mean, without a doubt, it goes without saying, we need to gather public input. You've got a great diversity of people here, but one of the reasons we're moving this group around the state after the meeting today is to do just that. And as will address some additional public hearings. Also, getting, more draft fact sheets and handouts brought to you, and I think that's something, and we use the word draft to make sure that you've had a chance to look at them and they make sense, and I think that's something to the consultant, and I see a nodding of the heads on that as well, that information is brought forward to it. And then, are there additional items that you feel that hasn't been covered here beyond what's been discussed or what's been promised? You all have brought up some very interesting and very useful points. I've seen the consultants taking notes like crazy. But are there other things that haven't been mentioned today that you believe that we should be talking about?
Well, in the way, things that haven't been mentioned that could lead to some action, I feel that it would be very useful to be in constant contact with the many other states who are doing similar things. They're all at different stages of development. Some are drafting legislation, some have legislation, some have task forces like this. And we're all in a way duplicating in different contexts our responses to the same questions. And I think it would be very helpful to be sort of networking with them.
Well,
that's a very good point, Marty, and I could just tell you that California is a member of a multi-state coalition, primarily the western states, that are considering this and regularly engaged with those folks. Gary Gutierrez could tell you about that. Norma Ortega is representing the state in that coalition effort.
The important thing, I think, for this group is that some of what you learn from those exchanges could be shared with us. Could influence our thinking.
Lee?
So this may sound anyway. So what is the, after listening today, I was thinking, well, why isn't a pure odometer-based sort of system an answer? Because it will measure miles driven. And then you just have to sort of calculate how much do you want to charge per mile? And I realize I throw that out as almost a straw man because I know there have to be some very good reasons why it isn't adequate. But if we really don't care about where people are driving, which I think is part of the message, then that's a thing that's already in people's cars, and you just have to say, look, why isn't that simply the zeroth most basic, simple answer?
Well, I think it needs to be. And I think you just called it. I mean, that's the beauty of this group. In fact, one of the things that Jim Whitty, I've heard his presentation enough times now, they actually have an option to where, and you can speak on it, Jack, you can just write a check for what is estimated as your flat amount, and you're done for the year. Do you want to comment on that?
No, I think you're spot on. I mean, that, a base level, and again, anything you want to do in regards to user choices, one of the choices is probably the variable of just reading the odometer. I mean, in other states, the reasons why it hasn't been the base is because they don't have universal inspection of vehicles to get an independent read of the yes, I know you're surprised at that, but like in Oregon, they've actually had a program over the last 2 to 3 years to do away with the annual inspections. And so that while it was in areas that were high environmental concern areas like Portland, you don't have to get your vehicle inspected by the state on a yearly basis if you're in eastern Oregon.
And we don't here either. We do have a smog check, which is every 2 or so years, but only if it's a vehicle over 6 years of age. So there are gaps in what we do.
Okay.
And the idea of the user choice, as Chairman Daffer said, one of the base items was to say, based on the maximum number of miles, and then taking a percentage of the maximum number of miles to say if you just wanted to write a check, you could write a check for this amount, or even progressive payments over the year for that amount to cover you for the year. And it was a way to get out. And in analyzing that actually isn't a bad method for people that are high volume drivers. When we get into limo, taxi, the people that actually are in that high mileage category, and they're in business, they like the idea of a fixed price because that's easier for them to handle in their business, and don't like the idea of the variable. Likewise, the idea for having a device that can even, all right, there's lots of things you do with GPS, but even in the Oregon system, what it's doing is saying that these miles were accumulated on a public road in Oregon, or they were on a private road, or they were on an out-of-state road, in which case those miles weren't accounted for. So it was a way to using the technology to minimize the tax that you were going to pay. And so, some people opted for that. But by giving them the choice, they could fit it to their lifestyle. So somebody that was doing a lot of out-of-state travel wanted to go with the GPS option, because then that gave them the ability that they didn't have to account for those miles. It did it automatically. Those people that were fearful of the technology, and we have a number of people that are fearful of the technology, they're not quite sure what it does, they're afraid of what it may do, they have options to just read the odometer or pay the flat fee if they think they're going that many miles in the year.
Supervisor?
Yeah, I think the reason we're here is because it isn't that simple. A solution would be is if it was that simple, every time you re-registered your car every year, you just report and you have a 3 times penalty, and that self-adjusts itself. So it could be. But we've heard about, we need to find out who's wrecking the roads, because the bottom line is we need to fix the roads, and there's not enough money to fix it. So that has to take into account the roads that you're traveling on, private roads. So if your odometer says you went 20,000 miles and only 15 was on public roads, then there has to be an adjustment in there, so you can't just report out that simple. And the other thing is when it comes to trucking, or the heavier, who is wrecking the roads, to put it in that basis form. So,
right, but even there, I could say, well, Eric's got these 10,000 trucks. Well, we know it's a truck. You can't hide the fact that it's a truck. So we're going to use a multiplier on the per mile. But again, that wouldn't require any sort of other recording.
And the trucking industry might come up with something on their own.
They might have a difference.
They may come up with their own plan that could be factored into this legislation.
Right.
And then this may end up just addressing passenger vehicles and smaller commercial vehicles.
And I think you're right on. If there is an adjustment for whether it's a small truck, big truck, private road, if you can factor in whatever that factor is, then you can certainly simplify the whole thing.
And, in all fairness to the truckers, if they're if they're in that heavy commercial area above the 10,000 pounds, they are actually underneath what's known as IFTA, or International Freight Transport fuel tax, that they actually are reporting their miles, so that if they bought fuel in Nevada and they're coming into California, they have to declare on a report each month how many miles they spent in California, and then there's a group that collects that, and that's on a distance charge that's been set, and then the argument is that the right rate or not the right rate based on what the multiplier may be for the road damage right now. But if you from the trucking agency, they actually are already accounting for miles that they spend in the state.
So I'm going to turn it, as soon as he gets done handing these out, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Kempton, who uses this document in a class that he teaches, and then I'm going to go from there and turn it over to Carrie to kind of guide us through our last item, which we've kind of already gotten into, but I want to give Carrie that.
One of the things that you asked about today was getting information on transportation funding. And so we're going to do two things. First of all, you have this book, and your homework assignment is to read pages 1 through 12. So the rest, you can look at the rest of it if you want, but you're not going to get any extra credit for that. I think the information that you're looking for is really in 1 through 12, and that's really only a couple of pages of charts. The rest of it is text. But just a whole bunch of information in this, and what I would suggest, Mr. Chairman, is maybe we would have at least 10 minutes maybe at the next meeting to answer any questions about this, because as you look through the charts, I can tell you from my experience with my students, you're going to have some questions and we can answer those. Nonetheless, it's probably the most comprehensive, short. Stephen Keck and the planning folks at Caltrans have put together a really good document here. The other thing is we will put together the two-page summary, because the two-page summary will lend itself to posting on the website, and we'll have other uses as well. So we'll take what's in here and try to synthesize that into a smaller summary. But I think you'll find this to be really quite informative, and we'll answer the question about basic transportation funding in the state.
Thanks a lot. And Will, if I could editorialize for a second, this is an excellent document, but the fact that it takes 29 pages to summarize transportation funding in the state is one of our challenges.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
Would it be appropriate for CTA to share a one-pager we put together on all the fees?
Yes.
That the industry pays?
Please.
Just to share with the group and let them know.
Absolutely.
what
That's
exactly
something you
our
could have
offer is.
staff distribute by email or bring to the next meeting, or both.
And we'll do the same thing with a sort of a motorist slice at that apple.
Yeah, I think the more of that interaction that we have amongst the various perspectives that you bring, and I've talked to many of you on the phone about this, it's important that you share where you're coming from. What Lee might have to say, or Gautam, on issues that are related to transparency and privacy. Those are issues. Eric and I had a great conversation regarding trucking issues, and I think all of these, that's where this starts getting into this interactive discussion. Jack?
Mr. Chair, just a comment. Will, for the number of people that are viewing this on television or reviewing this over the Internet, we probably, in the minutes, need to give them the reference so that they could read that document, too, if they wanted to download it.
And further, we'll put a link on the website as well.
Right. Yeah. These are PDF-able. Okay, Carrie, back to you.
Thank you, Chair. Based on our discussions today, we will be bringing back some to the March meeting, maybe some decision points for you to consider, policy decisions, kind of the low-hanging fruit for you to consider. Jeff Doyle has been keeping track of our discussion and some of the policy decisions that we could potentially bring back, and he's just going to go through that list.
Okay, thank you, Chairman Affer. Members
This is
of
what
the
we're calling
committee.
the parking lot, correct?
We have 3 items for you, or at least 3 categories of items. The first, as Carrie said, are things that we would like to do that we heard you say today, either request for information or ideas, that we can bring back either before the March meeting or at the March meeting. Then we have the parking lot, which are ideas or areas to pursue, but they maybe aren't quite ripe yet for next month. And then finally, potential decisions that we think after listening to the material at the March meeting, that you'll be in a position to make some decisions on what type of system you would recommend. So the first category, before the March meeting, Director Kempton handed out, I think, the transportation funding primer. We also had noted here whether or not you wanted to have some time set aside at the next meeting to go over that, and also the eligible uses of that funding and how or who maybe makes those funding decisions, just at high clip. Secondly, it was requested that there be a two-pager on the road charge working group that CTC will be convening, just so TAC members can have a little more background on that. Item 3, it was requested maybe a little more information about how the technical aspects of these recommendations that you're going to be making will be presented to you, and how the TAC will be working with D'Artagnan and other consultants on that. Item 4, it was requested that we have not only definitions of terms like sustainable revenue or equitable revenue, but also how we intend to measure them. Item 5 was requested that we more clearly lay out sort of the progression of what these policy level decisions that you will be making are going to be all throughout the process. In other words, over the next 10 months, but probably a little bit of front-loaded. We'll come back to you with that. The sixth item was when we discuss interoperability next month, we want to make sure that the policy implications of these technical options are also discussed at the same time. Privacy was one example that we were using today. Item 7, just looking at my notes here, I'm sorry. What I have written is a status report on the efforts to let the public know about the problem in transportation funding and what the TAC will be doing about that, even if the TAC does not yet have answers about what the system is going to look like, at least what the process for coming to some of those answers will be for the public. And then finally, status reports or some other reporting back mechanism where you can hear about what's happening in some of your neighboring states, whether it's from the Western RUC or not. On that last one, I just wanted to mention, someone sent me during the meeting here, that on April 28th in Portland, there will be a road usage charge conference and a financing event. It's sponsored by the IBTTA, International Bridge and Tunnel, yes, IBTTA, International Bridge and Tunnel Association in Portland. The two items that we have in the parking lot that were raised but probably not right for the March meeting are, one was be thinking about an analysis that might show, sort of as an interesting exercise, what a per mile rate would have to be if we were, as a policy goal, trying to replace all transportation taxes. I suppose we could do the analysis as well for the gas tax, and so you'd have some idea if you were to have one uniform tax or fee, what that might look like. A second parking lot item was to be thinking about how California might transition to a road charge system as opposed to a Big Bang theory or something like that. And we think that that'll be a discussion that will happen naturally over the course of the months. Mr. Chairman, finally, the decisions that we think that you'll be in a position to make next month. Now, again, just a little bit of foreshadowing. Next month will be heavy on the technology options. So we'll have the experts here to talk about methods of reporting and what the trade-offs are, because I think, as was mentioned earlier, you can have a manual system, but that does imply that there will be trade-offs along the way. So at that next meeting, we think some questions that would be ready for answering would be whether you want to have an open system or closed technology system for mileage reporting, whether you want to pursue interoperability as a system design principle, or whether you just want to worry about California and have a California-only system to start. Third, potentially, if you want to start addressing the policy question of whether heavy trucks would be in or out of at least the pilot system, because the legislation is not clear on that. The legislation says the policy purpose is to replace the gas tax. You could imply that that means diesel-paying vehicles weren't intended to be swept in, or you could conclude that since it's silent on it, it's within your purview. Fourth, whether to have multiple mileage reporting methods or just one. Hopefully you'd make that decision about hearing a little bit more about costs and complexities of multiple methods. And I think those are the issues that we have teed up. Unless other people have others.
Yeah, were there any others that had anything else that was not included on that? That's a good comprehensive list. Now, as to the parking lot issues, or issues that are going to take a little bit longer, I think a few of you had some mentions today, and I know Jeff took some notes on them, but was there anything glaring or anything specific that should be addressed?
To those of us who worry about the evolution of transportation, and the current pattern is mostly about a change in the form of travel, and like Lyft, Uber, Sidecar are emerging, forms of short-term, immediate carpooling being arranged, sort of on the fly through the web. There are changes in mobility across the life cycle, with elderly people doing different things and young people. And I wouldn't say that this should be a prime item on our agenda, but the systems that we think about should be informed by the notion that there is change in the nature of travel and urban form and so on in response to travel. And somehow that's why I'm putting it as a parking lot issue. Somehow that has to be informing what we're talking about. I don't think it should distract us from our main job, but the systems that we come up with should recognize that that driving in 10 years is going to be quite different than it is now.
I think that's outstanding, and I'm not sure yet what the status is on our technology panel for the next meeting, but certainly Eshwar is going to give us some information on telematics and what is going on in vehicles coming forward. And I believe, I don't think we've got it secured yet, but are we talking, Carrie, is that secured now, the automation piece? We're still working on it, so hopefully we'll get that to give you an insight. Since the CTC is meeting, the day before, I think, we're talking about possibly including that for the California Transportation Commission as well, because it's, as Marty says, for those of us that have seen what's coming down the pike, it's faster than anybody realizes, and it's going to really change a lot of the things that are out there that we consider normal today are going to be much different tomorrow.
One other item I would suggest for a parking lot, and it came up earlier today in some form, and maybe it's a little bit related to Professor Wax's suggestion, is that I think we should be talking also about how we think the revenues should be used. And one example I'll give is that while it might be that spending money on transit is not going to help a rural driver who doesn't have access to that transit, it may be something that we want to discuss is how do we want the availability or non-availability of transit to impact what the rate is, what the fee is, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. I could expand on it just from my own perspective. I'd like to know, and I don't know if this is a Stephen Keck issue or what, but at some point I would be interested in knowing, how big would that per mile number be if it included everything we're paying already in California? What's the number, 59 cents or something per gallon if you include everything? Is that
63.8 cents.
Thank you, sir. see, it went up since last week. No, I'm just kidding. That's what the public thinks. They think that it keeps going up, but so many of these things haven't changed for decades. But so if it is at 63, what would that number be if that all was inclusive? Because if truly at one point in the future, maybe it's 10 years from now, the gas tax is a goner, maybe 15 years, I don't know what. Somehow or another you're going to pay for the transportation, and it's pretty clear we're not keeping up with the demands right now, so what would that number really need to be? And is the public going to understand that? I suspect not. I suspect they're going to be pretty indignant against it. Who wants to have to pay more than you're already paying? They think that they're paying enough in taxes, and frankly, sometimes they probably are. But the reality is the system is the way it is. Money is not going to where it needs to go, or is not in the fashion it should be. Those are issues we're going to have to, at least, it's not our charge to deal with, but it's something that I think when a report is written, it wouldn't hurt to give the legislature, since that's ultimately where this product is going to go, at least a perspective that we thought about it too.
I mean, I haven't. Oh,
No, please.
I mean, because I have the excuse of not having read Will's pamphlet yet. But when you say all inclusive, do you really mean like all inclusive? I mean, when I drive from my house to my office, my house in Berkeley to my office in San Francisco, I am on, Berkeley streets. I'm on this viaduct. I'm on I-80. I'm on the Bay Bridge, which appears to be run by I don't know who. And then, I drive through the Tenderloin, and I just have no idea, segment by segment, what pays for what. And I'm just asking you, in that comment, did you mean every segment that I travel?
Perhaps so. And I'll tell you why. Because you just said exactly what I think is the biggest question mark out there, Lee. The most motoring public doesn't recognize when they're driving from, as you do in your commute, somehow or another, and that's why all those charts are so big, is because somehow or another money is flowing from someplace. It's either federal excise tax, it's state sales tax, it's gas tax, it's one thing or another. The trucking industry could tell you the same thing, all that they pay in. And ultimately, our cities are concerned about it. In fact, I was going to suggest we share with you all the CSAC League of Cities report that comes out every year, or every 2 years, that talks about the deficiency. What was the latest number, Susan? Was it $59 billion for just locals?
82.
82 billion just for local streets and roads. And, with gas taxes having gone down, all these public works officials around the state, both for counties, the 58 counties and the 484 cities, they're all going, oh my goodness, we're not getting the money we were expecting to get. And so now all of a sudden they don't have the money they were planning on for filling potholes. And again, why? Gas tax. It just gets back to why it's broken. But your point I was making was very serious. And yeah, so then you pay to go over the bridge that goes to whomever, and you don't use the fast track, so you pay as you go across. But, maybe one day, once privacy issues can be addressed, it might end up being that no matter where you are and no matter where you're driving, wherever you are is paying into those various pots that you drive. It's got to be equity. I heard this in D.C. Wyoming has got a much different road network system than, say, California. And you've got the rural drivers, and so they're, what are they? It's like the donor states versus, the receiving states. And it becomes an issue. So if this becomes ever federalized, it's definitely a lot of interesting issues that
Messy.
Yeah, messy is a good way.
But I'd like to point out, Lee, that you earlier said why not go with a simpler system of just measuring miles driven.
Right.
The answer is in the question you just asked. Because if we can monitor how many miles you've driven in each of those facilities, we can distribute the money more equitably. But if we only know how many miles you drove, we can't. That's why it's so interesting at how one issue tugs against the other.
See, I'm not sure they tug, because I feel like we can see where, I can see where the roads in Berkeley need to be fixed. There's a lot of needs for maintenance and for fixing where the information necessary to allocate or prioritize the spending can be done completely independently of any individual driver. That's my belief.
Absolutely not, because of the vicious disagreements as to what's equitable that come to the table when the locals say, well, the money's going to the state and our citizens are paying it and we're collecting nothing. When the truckers say we're paying more than our share, you need to know where people are traveling in order to arrive at an assessment of what's equitable. By the way, Berkeley pays for it out of property taxes.
Right. So that's one. But I know that when you see a pothole on Dwight Way, do you I don't think I care. Whether I drove over Dwight Way or whether Gottman drove over Dwight Way.
You don't care, but the officials in Sacramento have potholes too. and they're getting some state money, and the officials in Berkeley are getting some, or in that district of Caltrans are getting some state money, and we're challenged to distribute it fairly. And, of course, the people in Berkeley think they should get more, and the people in Sacramento think they should get more. And having the data as to where people traveled, under what conditions, is what, scholars and economists have been reaching for, so they could do it better.
I understand that it is the accepted conventional yardstick in the sector because it represents something that you can kind of set and then measure it, and since everyone agrees, they're not going to fight. I'm just saying that I don't actually think that it's if I want to make choices about transportation funding or improvement of housing or improvement of all sorts of social problems, the way that I would like to do it is to see where is the need, and then address the needs. Right? Where are the sickest people? It's not. You can figure that out, and then you go to where the problem is and you solve it. And where are the people least literate? Where are the roads worse? All of these can be. You can make factual assessments about where those problems are without necessarily monitoring everything. And if you have that, then why not use it? Now, it's a. I think what I'm hearing is that the politics of it is so nasty that no one wants to try to do anything other than do the sort of agreed upon way of doing it.
A truer statement has rarely been spoken. If I could just jump in with one suggestion or thought, and then I'm sorry. I think what would be helpful, partly to elaborate and inform this discussion, but also for the larger effort that we're undertaking here, is when we're going forward and when information is presented, it would be really good to have a complete delineation of every tax, fee, and government-required expense associated with driving, add those all up and identify them, then all of the uses of that money, regardless of their transportation or not, or roads or transit or whatever, and look at that. And then the third leg of this rickety stool is sort of what you were trying to touch on, is the need issue, and that can be debated, and there's plenty of studies and information on that. And putting those three pieces together will show the fractures in our systems, the lacking of our system, and perhaps paths forward. Okay.
The only thing that what you say, let's do it the traditional way. The only thing everyone who disagrees about how much money they should get, the only thing they agree on is we need more data. They all, at the end of the day, if we had better data, it would show that we have a stronger case. And what comes to me repeatedly is, if we're going to go through the huge effort of instituting a new system of charges, and we don't also get better data, we're missing an opportunity to do better what we've been trying to do better for the last 100 years. It really is 100 years since we instituted the gas tax. And the gas tax was instituted as a substitute for a toll, but an imperfect substitute. And when it was introduced in 1919 and 1920, people said, well, we can't, when you pay a toll, you pay at the time and place of use. When you pay gas tax, you don't. We would like to know the time and place of use so that we can have it mimic a toll more effectively. They actually said that 100 years ago. And for 100 years, we've been seeking that data. Now
Marty was there. I mean, he was part of it.
I don't like paying toll. I'd rather pay gas tax, personally.
But we're on the edge of, should we go through the political grief of changing the system? It's going to be painful no matter what we do. And also give away the opportunity to be able to fine-tune the distribution of the funds because we have better data. I'm not quite. I think in the end we'll end up doing that, but I'm not ready to take it on as a first principle at this point.
Pam?
Well, I was just going to add, you might have, in some part of Southern California, like my town, you might have a lot of potholes because you have a lot of economic vitality and people moving around, so the funds go there. But there could be another part of Los Angeles County where they want economic vitality. They don't have it now, but there could be some road improvement they made. They don't have potholes. So, so you don't want to just shift it. I'm just saying, should it all be shifted to where it is now, the activity and the issues, or how, what is the equity there, where things have been disadvantaged communities?
Right. Well, certainly the community has a choice.
Will, why don't you wrap this one up?
Yeah, let me see if I can do that, Mr. Chairman. First of all, when we talk about all of the information that Steve and Lee mentioned, I don't want to commit to having that by next meeting, but I think
he needs a semi-truck.
I thought you had that tattooed somewhere.
I do. I actually do, but the staff is not going to be happy if I agree to do one more thing. But I believe we can provide that information in fairly short order. And when you look at this number that you asked me about, what is the total tax on gasoline? It is the total tax. It's 63.8 cents and puts California at about number 5 in the nation. And there's a convoluted process that will lower that tax by 6 cents coming on July 1st, and we can talk about that a little more at our next meeting. But the excise tax, which is commonly referred to as the gas tax, is the major component of that larger number. It's about totally 54.5 cents, 18.4 cents is the federal excise tax, and 36 cents is the total state excise tax. So when we refer to the gas tax, as opposed to gas taxes, the gas tax typically relates to, at the state level, is the 36 cents. So that's kind of what we're talking about with respect to discussion on replacing the gas tax, if that's what we were looking to do, if we wanted to recommend further than that. And the bottom line and the closing statement is this task force advisory committee can recommend whatever you want to recommend. It's the legislature that will decide how the whole Apollo wax gets implemented, and I think we need to keep that ever in the back of our mind as we go through our exercise here.
And I'm sorry, just keep in mind also that what you're listing are the traditional transportation sources of money associated with driving. Right. There are registration fees, vehicle license fees, and the new cap and trade charges, all that, which are in people's minds. It's in the media.
I will
it's
include
a factor
those.
We need to deal with.
Yeah, and the list goes on. I mean, if the cap and trade is helping transit, much more so than it's helping, roads. And it was interesting. I'm so glad we have Senator Bell as part of this this task force. He was on the phone with the pro tem out in the hallway there. He came in to tell us, and it's nice that he can explain to the pro tem what we're doing here, as they have to figure out what they're going to do short term, because obviously, as Lee in this conversation we just heard, isn't going to get solved overnight. So there clearly has to be an interim. Let's see if there are any other issues from any other members of the task force, and then we'll then call on public comment, see if there's any members of the audience that would like to raise issues that we haven't talked about, and then we'll move to adjournment. Marty?
I just have, I'll try to be brief. The last one was too long. We should put in the parking lot, I think very important, at some point in our deliberations, we should be comparing notes with the California ARB, because this relates to cap and trade, it relates to AB 32, and if whatever the legislature does is endorsed by ARB as an environmental measure as well as a fundraising measure for transportation, the probability of success goes way, way up. So we have to be informed by what they would find acceptable, so that we can recommend things that are responsible with regard to AB 32.
So you're saying that we should make a political decision as to what we recommend to the legislature based on what the ARB says?
No, we should be informed by their positions.
You said we should find what they find acceptable.
If in the end what we recommend is something they can endorse, the probability of going forward is higher. If they're going to oppose it, we better know about it in advance. I think the two issues are related. That's all. It's an ethical question whether we sell out to them. The way you put it made it sound like we're going to adopt what they want for political reasons, and I think that's not that's not what I meant to say. What I meant to say is we should be well informed, and if we're going to confront them with something they won't oppose, we should at least know about it. But if we can agree with them, then the joint effort will likely be more successful.
And another calculus is what is acceptable to the public, and whether this ends up in a ballot measure or not. That's something we have to keep an eye on as well.
Yeah, I've been asked that. Is this something that's going to go on the ballot? And I said, well, I don't know. So that's a legal question. If it's replacing a tax, then maybe not. If it's a new tax, then probably so. Those are issues that, again, are above they're outside our wheelhouse. But clearly, it's okay to talk about it here without a doubt. And I think those are all legitimate issues. Everything should be brought up. Let's at this point turn to the public. I know there's some people that have been here. Is there anybody that is in the audience that wishes to address the task force? Seeing none.
One more comment.
Eric?
I don't think we made a decision on, there's a lot of information going on. It sounds like from an earlier conversation that folks were a little concerned with getting the information right before the meeting, and we were talking about having interim meetings before the meetings. Is that something we're going to consider? I know everybody's pressed for time, they have other jobs and other duties and responsibilities, but I know it would provide me and a lot of other folks some comfort level, a rising comfort level, if we were to have that option to have some in-between meetings.
Well, did everybody get a chance to hear, having some additional meetings? For me, I certainly would support. I want to make sure that they're going to be productive, and I don't think you're suggesting otherwise. I would venture a guess that we're probably going to not have another one until the Irvine meeting, but I do think, and I'll direct that to Carrie and to Jack and to the staff, that should there be a need for additional meetings, that it doesn't. I didn't hear a lot of objection. I don't think it would be like we're going to go from 12 to 24, but there might be a few more. As to your point regarding materials, I think now that our consultant is on board, I mean, they just basically started like last week, and you get right down to it. And they've done a lot in a short amount of time. So I think that as we move forward now, they're going to have a little bit more time to get things. Usually it gets vetted over at the staff level, and then those things are distributed. So I would imagine Carrie will be cracking the whip with Jack to get stuff earlier and make sure we get it out to all you all. Okay. Any other questions or comments? Well, seeing none, thank you very much for being here. We are adjourned until our meeting in Irvine.
On
March 27th, 2015. It's a Friday. Thank you very much. We're adjourned.